true scary stories for sleep. Welcome to the Midnight Echoes. Before we dive into tonight's stories, I'd love to know, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Drop a comment below. It's always fascinating to see where our viewers are tuning in from. If you enjoy the stories, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's get comfortable, unwind, and prepare for tonight's eerie adventures. It was late, and I was in a hurry to get home. The quickest way was through the underpass, a dark, narrow tunnel that cut beneath the highway. I had walked through it countless times before, but that night something felt different. The air was heavy, the shadows deeper, and the usual sounds of traffic overhead were strangely muted. I hesitated at the entrance, my instincts screaming at me to turn back, but I ignored them and stepped inside. The underpass was dimly lit, flickering bulbs casting eerie shadows on the damp concrete walls. My footsteps echoed unnervingly, the sound bouncing off the walls in a way that made it feel like someone was following me. I quickened my pace, trying to shake off the feeling of unease, but it clung to me like a second skin. The further I walked, the more oppressive the atmosphere became, as if the walls were closing in on me. Halfway through, I noticed something strange, a figure standing at the far end of the tunnel, barely visible in the dim light. They were motionless, their silhouette unnervingly still. My heart raced as I slowed down, unsure of what to do. The underpass was narrow, with no way around them, and the exit seemed impossibly far away. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching me with an intensity that sent chills down my spine. I considered turning back, but when I glanced over my shoulder, I saw another figure standing at the entrance, blocking my way out. Panic surged through me as I realized I was trapped between them, with no way to escape. The air grew colder, silence suffocating, and I could feel their eyes on me, unblinking and relentless. Desperate, I tried to run, but the figures didn't move. They just stood there, their presence suffocating, their dark silhouettes haunting. Every step I took felt heavier, as if the very air around me was thickening, slowing me down. The underpass, once a familiar shortcut, had become a nightmare, a place where the rules of reality no longer applied. Just as I was about to reach the exit, the figure at the far end finally moved. They stepped into the light, revealing a face that was both familiar and terrifying. A twisted reflection of myself, grinning with a malevolence that sent a wave of terror through me. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure behind me was already closing in, their footsteps echoing in the dark. With no other choice, I ran, bursting out of the underpass and into the night. The cool air hit my face and I gasped for breath, my body trembling with fear. I didn't stop running until I was safely inside my apartment, the memory of the underpass still fresh in my mind. I never walked that way again, and I never found out who or what those figures were. But the haunting image of my twisted reflection still lingers, a chilling reminder of the night I narrowly escaped whatever nightmare lurked in the shadows. As a helicopter pilot, I was used to flying over remote areas, places untouched by civilization. But that flight was different. There was something unsettling about the silence that surrounded me as I soared above the dense forest below. The radio had gone quiet, and no matter how many times I tried to reach the base, there was no response. The usual hum of the rotor blades seemed muted, as if the air itself was absorbing the sound, leaving me in a cocoon of eerie stillness. I continued on my flight path, my eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of life. But the landscape was barren, just endless stretches of trees, their dark shadows stretching like fingers across the earth. It wasn't long before I noticed something strange, a hidden compound nestled deep within the forest, its buildings barely visible through the thick canopy. It wasn't on any of my maps, and there were no signs of activity, just an eerie stillness that matched the silence in the air. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate. I circled the compound, searching for a place to land, but the area seemed unnervingly deserted. Buildings were old, the walls covered in moss and vines, and the few vehicles I could see were rusted and abandoned. It was as if the place had been forgotten by time, a relic of a past that no one wanted to remember. I landed in a clearing nearby, the silence deafening as I shut down the engine. The air was thick with tension. Every step I took felt heavy, as if the forest itself was watching me. I approached the compound cautiously, my instincts screaming at me to turn back, but something drew me closer, an unseen force that pulled me deeper into the heart of the abandoned complex. Inside, the buildings were worse, dark, damp, and filled with the scent of decay. The walls were covered in strange symbols, scratched into the concrete with a frantic energy that sent chills down my spine. There were no signs of life, no clues as to what had happened here. Just the oppressive silence and the feeling of being watched. As I explored further, the sense of unease grew stronger. I found rooms filled with old equipment, their screens flickering with static, as if they were still trying to receive signals from a world long gone. The air was heavy with the weight of something unspeakable, a dark presence that clung to every corner of the compound. It felt like the walls were closing in on me, suffocating me with their secrets. Then I heard it. Faint whisper, so soft I almost missed it. It echoed through the empty halls, growing louder with each step I took. The sound was disorienting, coming from all directions at once. I realized I wasn't alone. The shadows seemed to shift, moving in ways that defied logic, and the air grew colder, heavier, as if something was trying to reach out to me. Panic surged through me, and I turned to leave, but the compound seemed to have other plans. The exit, once so close, now seemed impossibly far away, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. I could feel their presence all around me, unseen but undeniably there, closing in with every step. The silence, once oppressive, was now suffocating, filled with the weight of things better left forgotten. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I stumbled out of the compound and back to the helicopter. The engine roared to life, shattering the eerie stillness, and I took off into the sky, desperate to leave the place behind. As I flew away, the compound disappeared into the trees, its dark secrets hidden once more. I never reported what I found, and I never returned. But the memory of that silent flight still haunts me, a reminder that some places are better left undiscovered. It was late, and I was tired, waiting for the last train of the night at a nearly deserted station. The air was thick with fog, and the dim lights cast long shadows across the empty platform. The usual hustle and bustle of commuters had faded, leaving only an eerie silence clung to the air. As I sat on the bench, my eyes grew heavy, and I almost drifted off. The sudden arrival of a train's horn snapped me awake. The train pulled in slowly, its headlights cutting through the fog, but something about it felt off. Carriages were old, their paint chipped and faded, and the windows were dark, reflecting nothing but the dim lights of the station. I hesitated for a moment, but the cold air urged me to board. I stepped onto the train, finding myself in an empty carriage. The doors hissed shut behind me, and the train began to move. The carriage was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the engine as it sped through the night. I settled into a seat, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that clung to me, but it was hard to ignore the emptiness of the train. I glanced around, expecting to see other passengers, but the carriage was completely deserted. Even the conductor was nowhere to be seen. As the train sped on, the fog outside grew thicker, swallowing the landscape until there was nothing but white mist pressing against the windows. The world outside seemed to disappear, leaving me trapped in the carriage with only my thoughts and the unsettling silence. The train showed no sign of stopping, and I began to wonder if I had boarded the wrong one. Then, the lights flickered. It was just for a moment, but in that brief darkness, I saw them. Shadowy figures standing at the far end of the carriage, their forms barely visible in the dim light. My heart raced as the lights flickered again, and the figures seemed to move closer, their faces hidden in the shadows. I could feel their eyes on me, watching with an intensity that sent chills down my spine. I stood up, trying to move to another carriage. the doors wouldn't open. The train felt like a prison, and the figures were closing in, their presence suffocating. The lights flickered once more, plunging the carriage into darkness, and I could hear them now. Soft whispers, eerie and unintelligible, filling the air with a sense of dread. I knew I had to get out, but there was nowhere to go. Just as I was about to give in to the fear, the train screeched to a halt, and the doors hissed open. I stumbled out onto an unfamiliar platform, gasping for breath as the train disappeared into the fog, its headlights fading into the distance. The station was empty, the air thick with an eerie stillness that matched the one I had left behind on the train. I never saw that train again, and I never found out where it was going. The memory of that night still haunts me. The image of those shadowy figures, and the feeling of being trapped on a train that seemed to be heading nowhere. The station, once a place of routine and safety, had become a place of nightmares, and I never boarded a late-night train again. Some journeys, I learned, are better left untraveled. We found the map in a dusty old bookstore, hidden among a pile of forgotten relics. It was yellowed with age, edges frayed, and the markings on it were faded and cryptic. But there was something about it, drew us in, promise of adventure, of uncovering a hidden place that no one else had found. The shopkeeper warned us that the map led to a place that didn't exist, but we didn't listen. We were too eager for the thrill of the unknown. The map led us deep into the wilderness, far from any marked trails or familiar landmark. The terrain grew rougher, air colder, till we ventured further into uncharted territory. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the landscape, and a sense of unease settled over us. The map seemed to shift and change with every step we took, the landmarks on it no longer matching the world around us. As night fell, we realized we were lost. The path we had been following disappeared, swallowed by the dense forest that now surrounded us. The map, once a guide, became a puzzle, its cryptic markings leading us in circles. Panic began to set in as we tried to find our way back, but every turn we took led us deeper into the wilderness, farther from the safety of civilization. Then the forest began to change. The trees twisted into unnatural shapes, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal hands. The air grew thick with fog, and strange sounds echoed through the darkness. Whispers, footsteps, and the faint rustling of leaves. It felt like the forest was alive, watching us with a malevolent presence that sent chills down our spines. We tried to follow the map. The more we looked at it, the more confusing it became. The markings seemed to shift and blur, and new paths appeared where none had been before. The sense of direction that had guided us vanished, and we were left stumbling through the dark, lost in a place that didn't exist. The forest closed in around us, the shadows growing deeper, the whispers louder. Then we saw it, a small, decrepit cabin hidden among the trees. It wasn't marked on the map, but it was the only shelter in sight. Desperate for a place to rest, we made our way inside, but the air was thick with the scent of decay, and the walls were covered in strange symbols. The cabin felt wrong, like a place that had been forgotten by time, and we quickly realized that we weren't alone. The shadows inside the cabin seemed to move on their own, and the whispers followed us inside, growing louder with every passing moment. The map, now useless, lay discarded on the floor, its secrets hidden once more. We tried to leave, but the door wouldn't budge, and the windows showed nothing but darkness. The cabin had trapped us, and the forest outside seemed to pulse with a dark energy that kept us confined within its walls. In the end, we never found our way back. The map had led us to a place that didn't exist, a place where time and reality no longer mattered. The forest, the cabin, the whispers, they all became a part of us, just as we became a part of them. The shopkeeper had been right. Some places are better left undiscovered. The GPS had malfunctioned, leaving me stranded in the middle of nowhere, with no idea where I was or how to get back on track. The road stretched out before me, empty and unfamiliar, cutting through a desolate landscape. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the asphalt, and the air was thick with an eerie stillness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I had no choice but to keep driving, hoping to find a familiar landmark or a sign that would lead me back to civilization. The road seemed endless, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. Every time I thought I recognized something, the landscape changed, shifting like a mirage. The sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the world into darkness, and the road ahead became a winding, labyrinthine path that felt more like a trap than a route home. The GPS remained stubbornly silent. The screen blank, and I began to wonder if I'd ever find my way out. Then I saw it. A small town up ahead, its lights flickering faintly in the distance. Relief washed over me as I pulled into the town, eager to ask for directions and get back on track. But as I drove through the streets, I noticed something strange. The town seemed frozen in time. The buildings were old and weathered, their windows dark and empty. There were no people, no cars, just an eerie silence that clung to the air like a thick fog. I tried to find a gas station or a convenience store, but everything was closed. The signs faded and the doors locked. The town felt abandoned, as if it had been forgotten by the world. The only sound was the faint hum of the engine as I idled at an intersection, trying to decide which way to go. But every turn I took led me back to the same place. The same streets, the same empty buildings. It was as if the town was a maze, and I was trapped inside it. Desperation set in as I realized I couldn't leave. The road that had brought me here had vanished, swallowed by the darkness, and the town loomed around me like a silent sentinel. The street lights flickered, casting long, eerie shadows across the pavement, and I could feel eyes on me, watching, waiting. The town, once merely unsettling, now felt alive with a dark energy, a presence that seemed to pulse beneath the surface. Then, I saw them, figures standing in the shadows, their faces hidden in the darkness. They didn't move, didn't speak, just watched me with an intensity that sent chills down my spine. I tried to drive away, but the road kept looping back to the same place, the same intersection, the same silent town. The figures were closer now, their eyes gleaming in the dim light, and I knew I was trapped. With no other choice, I stopped the car and got out, my heart pounding in my chest. The air was thick with tension, and the town seemed to close in around me, the buildings leaning closer, their windows like dark, hollow eyes. The figures were everywhere now, surrounding me, their presence suffocating. I could feel their cold breath on my skin, hear their whispers in my ears, and I knew there was no escape. The next morning, the town was gone. I found myself back on the open road. The sun rising over the horizon, the GPS working again as if nothing had happened. But the memory of that night still haunts me. The ghost road, the silent town, the figures in the shadows. I never found out what happened, and I never went back. But I know that somewhere out there, the road still leads to that forgotten place, waiting for the next traveler to stumble upon its dark secrets. We rented a boat for the day, eager to explore the remote island that had intrigued us for years. It was said to be untouched by civilization, a hidden gem in the middle of the ocean, accessible only by those brave enough to venture out on their own. The weather was perfect, water calm and clear, and we were filled with excitement as we approached the island, its dense jungle and rocky shores beckoning us to come ashore. The island was as beautiful as we had imagined. Tall trees swaying in the breeze, the sound of waves crashing against the rocks, and the smell of salt in the air. We docked the boat and began to explore, our footsteps crunching on the sandy beach as we made our way into the jungle. The air was thick with the scent of earth and foliage, and the island felt alive with the sounds of nature. But as we ventured deeper, we began to notice strange things. The jungle grew denser, trees taller, and the shadows darker. The air grew heavy, and the sounds of nature seemed to fade, replaced by an eerie silence that clung to the air. We found signs of previous visitors, abandoned campsites, rusted tools, and faded footprints in the sand. But there were no people, no signs of life, just the feeling that we were being watched. The sense of unease grew stronger as the day wore on. The island, once a paradise, now felt like a trap. Its its beauty hiding something dark and malevolent. We tried to find our way back to the boat, but the jungle seemed to twist and turn, leading us in circles. The familiar landmarks we had passed on the way in were now gone, replaced by dense foliage and twisted trees that seemed to move on their own. Then we heard it, a low, guttural growl that echoed through the jungle. It was followed by the sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, coming from all around us. Panic surged through us as we realized we weren't alone. The island, once a place of beauty, had become a nightmare, and something was hunting us. We ran, desperate to escape. The jungle closed in around us, the air thick with tension. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and we could feel the presence of something dark and ancient, something that had claimed the island as its own. The boat, our only way off the island, was nowhere to be found, and the shoreline seemed impossibly far away. Finally, after what felt like hours of running, we burst through the trees and onto the beach. But the boat was gone, and the island loomed behind us, its dark silhouette a haunting reminder of the nightmare we had narrowly escaped. We never spoke of that day again, and we never returned to the island. But the memory of those footsteps, the growls in the dark, and the feeling of being hunted still haunts us. It was supposed to be a quiet night of studying, a few hours spent in the university library catching up on assignments. The building was nearly empty, the usual hustle and bustle of students replaced by the soft hum of the air conditioning and the faint rustle of pages being turned. I found a quiet corner on the top floor, far from the few other students who were still there, and settled in for a long night of work. Time passed quickly, and before I knew it, clock struck midnight. The library's closing announcement echoed through the halls, reminding everyone to pack up and leave. I gathered my things, but as I made my way to the exit, I realized something was wrong. The lights were off, the doors locked, and the building was completely silent. I was trapped. At first, I tried to remain calm, telling myself that it was just a mistake and that someone would come to let me out. But as the minutes ticked by, the silence grew oppressive, and the darkness seemed to close in around me. The once familiar library, filled with books and knowledge, had become a place of shadows and whispers. I wandered through the halls, searching for a way out, but every door was locked, every window barred. The air grew colder, and the silence was broken only by the faint sound of footsteps. Soft, deliberate, and coming from somewhere behind me. I turned, but there was no one there, just the dark, empty corridors stretching out before me. Panic set in as the footsteps grew louder, closer. The library, once a place of safety and learning, had become a labyrinth of fear. The books on the shelves seemed to watch me, their spines twisted and distorted in the dim light. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding, and I could feel eyes on me, unseen but undeniable. Desperate to escape, I tried to find the security office, hoping to contact someone for help. The footsteps followed me, their sound growing more insistent with every step I took. The library was no longer a place of knowledge. It was a place of nightmares, and I was its prisoner. Finally, I found the security office, but the phones were dead, screens blank. Footsteps stopped just outside the door, and I knew I wasn't alone. The air grew colder, and I could hear faint whispers, voices that seemed to come from the very walls. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest, but the door behind me slammed shut, trapping me inside. The next morning, the library staff found me huddled in the corner of the security office, trembling with fear. I never told them what happened, and I never returned to that library. But the memory of that night, footsteps in the dark, and the feeling of being watched still haunts me. The library, once a place of knowledge, had become a place of nightmares, and I was lucky to escape. As a wildlife photographer, I've spent years capturing the beauty and majesty of nature, always on the lookout for the perfect shot. The national park I was visiting was known for its diverse wildlife, and I was eager to explore its vast landscapes. The day started off normally enough. Deer grazing in the meadows, birds singing in the trees, and the occasional glimpse of a fox darting through the underbrush. But as the day wore on, I began to notice something strange. The animals were acting differently. The deer, normally skittish and alert, stood motionless, their eyes fixed on something in the distance. Birds, usually full of life and song, were silent, perched on the branches like statues. And the foxes, there were so many of them, more than I had ever seen in one place, watched me with an intensity that sent chills down my spine. At first, I tried to brush it off as a coincidence, but the strange behavior continued. The animals seemed to be following me, their eyes tracking my every move. The air grew heavy, and the usual sounds of the forest faded into an eerie silence. It felt like the entire park was watching me, waiting for something to happen. Then I saw it. A large, dark shape moving through the trees, too fast for me to make out any details. The foxes scattered, their eyes still locked on me as they disappeared into the underbrush. The deer bolted, their hooves pounding the ground as they fled. The birds took to the sky, their wings beating frantically against the air. Whatever it was coming for me. Panic surged through me as I tried to find a way out of the forest. The path, once clear and well-marked, now seemed twisted and overgrown, leading me in circles. Trees loomed over me, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal hands. The air was thick with tension, and every step I took felt like a step closer to danger. Finally, I reached the edge of the forest, gasping for breath as I stumbled out into the open. The animals were gone, the strange behavior vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. The park, once a place of beauty and serenity, had become a place of fear, and I knew I had to leave. To this day, I don't know what I encountered in that park, but the memory of those strange animal encounters still haunts me. The way they watched me, the way they seemed to know something I didn't. It's a feeling I'll never forget. I've continued my work as a wildlife photographer, but I've never returned to that park. Some places, I've learned, are better left undisturbed. It was just another late-night trip to the convenience store. Quick stop to grab some snacks before heading home. The store was quiet, the fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow on the empty aisles. The cashier greeted me with a tired nod, barely looking up from his phone as I wandered through the store. Everything seemed normal, until it wasn't. As I reached for a bag of chips, I noticed something strange. The other customers were staring at me. They stood motionless in the aisles, their eyes locked on me with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. But when I glanced around again, they were still watching me, their faces blank and expressionless. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that it was just late and I was tired. But the feeling of being watched grew stronger, and the air in the store seemed to thicken with an oppressive weight. The cashier, who had been so disinterested before, now seemed to be watching me too, his eyes following my every move. The store, once a place of routine and familiarity, had become something sinister. I quickly grabbed my things and made my way to the register, eager to leave. But as I approached the counter, the lights flickered, and the store was plunged into darkness. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerators in the back. My heart raced as I fumbled for my phone, trying to find the flashlight, but when the lights came back on, the store was empty. Customers, the cashier, they were all gone. The store was eerily silent, the shelves still stocked, but no sign of anyone else. Panic surged through me as I realized I was alone, trapped in a place that no longer felt real. The air was thick with tension, and every shadow seemed to shift and move on its own. Desperate to escape, I made my way to the door, but it wouldn't budge. The windows, which had shown the darkened street outside, were now pitch black, as if the world beyond the store had disappeared. The store had become a prison, and I was its only occupant. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, so soft I almost missed it. It echoed through the aisles, growing louder with every step I took. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist, taking on forms that were barely visible in the dim light. I could feel their eyes on me, watching from the darkness, waiting for me to make a move. Finally, with a surge of adrenaline, I threw myself against the door, and it flew open with a crash. I stumbled out into the night, gasping for breath as the cool air hit my face. The store behind me was silent, its lights flickering in the distance as if nothing had happened. But I knew the truth. Something terrible had been lurking inside, and I had narrowly escaped. I never returned to that store, and I never go out late at night anymore. The memory of those staring eyes, the oppressive silence, and the feeling of being trapped still haunts me. The late-night store, once a place of convenience, had become a place of nightmares, and I was lucky to get out alive. The subway station was nearly deserted, the usual rush of commuters replaced by the faint hum of the escalators and the distant rumble of trains. I had missed my usual ride home, so I waited for the last train of the night, the dim lights casting eerie shadows across the platform. The air was thick with the scent of damp concrete, and the only sound was the faint drip of water echoing through the tunnels. When the train finally arrived, it screeched to a halt with a deafening roar, the doors hissing open to reveal an empty carriage. I stepped inside, the doors closing behind me with a soft thud. The train lurched forward, the lights flickering as it sped through the darkened tunnels. The usual sense of routine and familiarity was gone, replaced by an unsettling silence that clung to the air like a shroud. I settled into a seat, trying to shake off the feeling of unease, but it was hard to ignore the emptiness of the train. The seats, usually filled with tired commuters, were all empty, and the windows reflected nothing but darkness. The train showed no sign of stopping, and I began to wonder if I had boarded the wrong one. Then the lights flickered again, plunging the carriage into darkness. In that brief moment, I saw them. Shadowy figures standing at the far end of the carriage, their forms barely visible in the dim light. My heart raced as the lights flickered back on. The figures were gone, as if they had never been there. The train continued to speed through the tunnels, its destination unknown. As the minutes ticked by, the sense of unease grew stronger. The train didn't stop at any of the usual stations, and the familiar landmarks outside the windows were replaced by endless stretches of dark tunnels. The air grew colder, and the silence was broken only by the faint sound of footsteps, soft, deliberate, and coming from somewhere behind me. Panic set in as I tried to find the conductor, but the doors between the carriages were locked, and the train showed no signs of stopping. The figures, once just shadows, now seemed more solid, their presence suffocating. I could feel their eyes on me, watching with an intensity that sent chills down my spine. The train had become a prison, and I was its only prisoner. Desperate to escape, I tried to force the doors open. They wouldn't budge. The lights flickered again, and the figures were closer now, their dark forms looming in the dim light. The train roared through the tunnels, its speed increasing, as if it was trying to outrun something unseen. But the figures were always there, just out of reach, watching and waiting. Finally, after what felt like hours, the train screeched to a halt, the doors hissing open to reveal an empty platform. I stumbled out, gasping for breath as the train disappeared into the darkness, its headlights fading into the distance. The station was silent, the air thick with an eerie stillness that matched the one I had left behind on the train. I never saw that train again, and I never found out where it was going. The memory of that night still haunts me. The image of those shadowy figures and the feeling of being trapped on a train that seemed to be heading nowhere. The subway, once a place of routine and safety, had become a place of nightmares, and I never boarded a late-night train again. Some journeys, I learned, are better left untraveled. It was supposed to be a simple cycling trip through the countryside, peaceful escape from the chaos of daily life. I had mapped out a route that would take me through some quiet, scenic roads, far from the usual traffic. But as I pedaled through an unfamiliar town, I noticed a sign for a detour. It promised a shortcut that would shave off a few miles, so I took it without a second thought. I wish I hadn't. The road quickly turned rough, narrowing into a gravel path that wound through dense woods. The sunlight struggled to filter through the trees, casting eerie shadows that danced in the corners of my vision. Farther I went, the more isolated I felt. The town had disappeared behind me, and there were no signs of life, just the oppressive silence of the forest. After what felt like hours, I came across a small, dilapidated village nestled in the trees. The buildings were old and crumbling, overgrown with vines, and the air was thick with a musty, decaying smell. There was something unsettling about the place, but I was too tired to turn back. I decided to stop and rest, hoping to find someone who could point me back to the main road. As I walked through the village, I noticed something strange. There were no people. The streets were deserted, the houses abandoned, yet I could feel eyes on me. The silence was oppressive, and every creak of the wood, every rustle of leaves made my heart race. The village felt like a trap, a place that had been forgotten by time, but was still very much alive with a chilling presence. I tried to leave, but the path out of the village seemed to twist and change with every step. No matter which direction I took, I ended up back in the same place, staring at the same decrepit buildings. Panic began to set in as I realized I was trapped in this eerie, forgotten town, with no way out and no one to help me. That's when I saw them, figures moving in the shadows, just out of sight. They were watching me, waiting for something. Their presence was suffocating, and I could feel their malice in the air. I started running, my bike forgotten as I tried to escape the village's haunting grip. But no matter how fast I went, the figures were always there, just behind me, their footsteps echoing mine. I stumbled into an old church, its doors hanging loosely on rusted hinges. Inside, the air was damp and cold, and the walls were covered in strange symbols. I could hear whispers all around me, though I was alone. The shadows in the corners seemed to move on their own, creeping closer as the whispers grew louder. I knew I had to get out. The figures were closing in, blocking every exit. With no other choice, I made a desperate dash for the door, bursting out into the night. The village was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of the moon filtering through the trees. Figures were still following, their movements unnatural, their intentions clear. I grabbed my bike and pedaled as fast as I could, my legs burning with exhaustion, my heart pounding in my chest. Somehow, I found the road again, though I didn't know how. The village vanished behind me, swallowed by the darkness. I didn't stop until I reached the safety of the main highway, where the distant lights of civilization brought a wave of relief. I never looked back, not even once. To this day, I don't know what I stumbled into, but I've never taken a detour since. The memory of that eerie village and its haunting inhabitants still sends chills down my spine. A reminder that some shortcuts aren't worth the risk. I've always loved late-night runs, cool air and quiet streets, offering a peaceful escape from the day's chaos. That night, I decided to jog across an old bridge on the outskirts of town, a place I'd heard whispers about but never visited. The bridge had a reputation for being haunted, with tales of ghostly figures and eerie occurrences, but I didn't believe in such thing, or at least I didn't until that night. As I approached the bridge, thick fog began to roll in, swirling around the arches like a ghostly veil. The structure itself was ancient, stone worn smooth by time and weather. The moonlight barely penetrated the fog, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to shift and move as I jogged closer. The atmosphere was chilling, but I pushed forward, determined to complete my run. The moment I set foot on the bridge, the temperature dropped sharply. My breath came out in visible puffs, and the usual sounds of the night, crickets, rustling leaves, fell silent. The only noise was the soft thud of my footsteps on the stone, echoing unnervingly in the stillness. As I reached the middle of the bridge, I felt it, an oppressive presence, heavy and cold, like I was being watched. I slowed to a walk, my senses on high alert. That's when I saw them, figures emerging from the fog, their forms barely visible but undeniably there. They moved slowly, almost gliding, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Panic gripped me as I realized they were heading straight for me, their eerie presence growing stronger with every step. I tried to turn back, The fog had thickened, swallowing the path behind me. The figures were closer now, their faces twisted in expressions of sorrow and anger. Their voices whispered through the air, unintelligible but filled with a haunting sense of despair. It felt like the bridge was alive, trapping me between its ancient stones and the spirits that haunted it. Desperate, I broke into a run, my feet pounding against the stone as I tried to outrun the figures. But no matter how fast I went, they were always there, just behind me. Their ghostly forms flickering in and out of the fog. The bridge seemed to stretch on forever, an endless path that offered no escape. My heart raced, my breath came in ragged gasps, and the fear became overwhelming. Suddenly, the fog parted, revealing the edge of the bridge up ahead. Hope surged through me, and I pushed myself harder, determined to reach the other side. But as I neared the end, one of the figures appeared directly in my path, blocking my way. Its hollow eyes stared into mine, and I felt a wave of icy terror wash over me. The air grew heavy, and my legs felt like lead as I struggled to keep moving. In a final act of desperation, I veered to the side, narrowly avoiding the figure as I sprinted off the bridge. The moment my feet touched solid ground, the oppressive presence lifted, and the fog began to dissipate. I collapsed on the road, gasping for breath, my heart still pounding from the terror I had just escaped. When I finally looked back, the bridge was shrouded in darkness, the figures gone as if they had never been there. But I knew what I had seen, and the memory of those ghostly forms still haunts me. I've never returned to that bridge, and I've never jogged at night again. Some places are better left undisturbed, their shadows hiding secrets that are too chilling to face. The storm came out of nowhere, a massive tornado ripping through the sky and forcing us to take refuge in the storm shelter. It was an old, rusty thing, buried in the backyard of the house we'd rented for the weekend. The wind howled outside as we hurried down the steps, the heavy door slamming shut behind us with a chilling finality. Inside, the air was musty, and the dim light from our flashlights flickered. We tried to make ourselves comfortable in the cramped space. At first, we were just relieved to be safe, but as the minutes ticked by, the unease began to set in. There was something unsettling about the shelter. The walls seemed too close, the silence too thick. It wasn't just the storm making me nervous. It was something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The others felt it too, their laughter and small talk fading into a tense quiet. As we settled in for what we thought would be a short stay, I noticed a strange box in the corner, half buried under some old blankets. It was metal, covered in dust and rust, and seemed out of place in the otherwise bare shelter. Curiosity got the better of me, and I pulled it out, brushing off the grime. The box was locked, but the latch was old and brittle. With a little force, it popped open. Inside, we found a collection of old photographs, yellowed with age, and a journal. Photos were eerie, showing the shelter we were in, but years ago. People in the pictures looked grim, almost frightened, and there were strange markings on the walls behind them, symbols we hadn't noticed in the dim light. My heart began to race as I flipped through the journal, the entries becoming more frantic with each page. The journal belonged to the previous owners of the house, and their story was chilling. They had built the shelter not just for storms, but for something else, something they believed was lurking in the area. The entries spoke of strange noises at night, of shadows moving just beyond the edge of the property, and of disappearances that the authorities couldn't explain. The final entry was hastily scrawled, warning whoever found the journal to never stay in the shelter after dark. The wind howled louder outside, and the shelter seemed to groan in response. We were all on edge now, the atmosphere thick with fear. The symbols on the walls, which we could now see clearly, glowed faintly in the darkness. It was as if the shelter itself was trying to warn us, or perhaps trap us. The realization that we might not be alone in that tiny space crept over us, and every creak and groan of the metal walls sent shivers down my spine. Then, the lights went out. The single bulb that had provided a weak glow flickered and died, plunging us into complete darkness. Panic set in as we fumbled with our flashlights, their beams casting eerie shadows on the walls. That's when we heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible scratching sound coming from the far end of the shelter. It was faint, but it was there, and it was getting closer. We huddled together, our breaths coming in shallow gasps as the scratching grew louder. The door to the shelter began to rattle, not from the wind, but from something on the other side, something that wanted to get in. The storm outside seemed to rage harder, as if in response to whatever was happening inside. We knew we had to get out. The storm still raged above us, and the door was our only protection. Just as the scratching reached a fever pitch, the storm suddenly died down, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. The door stopped rattling, and the shelter fell deathly quiet. We didn't waste any time. We grabbed what we could and bolted for the exit. The moment we stepped outside, the air felt different, heavy with a sense of dread. We didn't look back as we ran toward the house, desperate to put as much distance between us and the shelter as possible. The next day, we packed up and left without a word. The storm shelter remained untouched, its secrets buried once again. But the memory of that night, the symbols, the journal, and the scratching at the door, those will stay with me forever. Some places are meant to protect you, but others hide secrets that are better left undiscovered. The carnival seemed to appear out of nowhere. One day just a vacant lot, the next filled with flashing lights and the sounds of laughter. My partner and I decided to check it out, drawn by the bright colors and the smell of cotton candy in the air. Felt like stepping into another world, a place where reality bent and everything was just a little too perfect. But as night fell, that perfection turned eerie, and the carnival took on a chilling edge. At first, everything seemed normal. We played some games, ate too much junk food, and rode the Ferris wheel as the sun dipped below the horizon. But as darkness settled in, the atmosphere shifted. The laughter of the crowd grew hollow, and the shadows seemed to stretch too far, swallowing the light. The carnival workers, once friendly and cheerful, now wore unsettling grins that didn't quite reach their eyes. We decided to leave, but when we tried to find the exit, the path twisted and turned in ways that didn't make sense. The brightly lit signs that had welcomed us now pointed in every direction except out. Carnival, once full of people, was suddenly empty, the booths abandoned, and the rides creaking in the wind. Panic set in as we realized we were trapped in this eerie funhouse with no clear way out. The more we walked, the more the carnival seemed to change around us. The colorful tents and cheerful music faded, replaced by dark, twisted shapes and low, haunting melodies. The mirrors in the funhouse reflected distorted versions of ourselves, warped, grotesque, and grinning back at us with sinister intent. Every turn we took led us deeper into the nightmare, air growing thick with dread. Then we saw them, figures lurking in the shadows, just out of sight. At first we thought they were other carnival goers, lost like us. But as they drew closer, their forms became clearer, and the realization hit us. They weren't human. Their eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and their movements were jerky, unnatural. They watched us with an intensity that sent chills down my spine. We tried to run, but the carnival seemed to stretch on forever, an endless maze of twisted attractions and eerie silence. Figures followed us, their footsteps growing louder, more insistent. We stumbled into a darkened tent, hoping to hide, but the moment we entered, flaps closed behind us, trapping us inside. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the only light came from a flickering bulb overhead. In the center of the tent stood a single mirror, taller than any we had seen before. Its surface rippled like water, and as we approached, we saw something terrifying. Our own reflection, but with twisted, malevolent expression. The reflections grinned at us, their eyes gleaming with dark intent. Felt like the mirror was trying to pull us in, to trap us in the nightmare forever. Desperate to escape, we backed away, but the tent walls seemed to close in on us, the fabric twisting and writhing like a living thing. The figures outside began to scratch at the tent, their nails scraping against the fabric with a chilling sound. Just when we thought there was no way out, the tent flaps burst open, and we ran out into the night, not stopping until we were far from the carnival. When we finally looked back, the carnival was gone. vanished as if it had never been there. The vacant lot was empty once again. The lights and sounds of the carnival, nothing but a haunting memory. We never spoke of what happened that night, but the nightmare lingered in our minds. Whatever that place was, it wasn't meant for the living, and we were lucky to have escaped. It was a late night, and I was the last passenger to board the ferry. The waters were calm, and the city lights gradually faded into the distance as the ferry pushed out into the dark, open water. I found a quiet spot on the deck, eager to relax after a long day. The hum of the engine and the gentle sway of the boat were almost soothing, but as the night deepened, an eerie stillness settled over the ferry that I couldn't ignore. The first sign that something was wrong came when I noticed how empty the ferry seemed. There had been a few other passengers when we left, but now the deck was deserted. I wandered inside, expecting to find them in the cabin, but it was empty too. The only sound was the creaking of the ship as it moved through the water. It was as if everyone had vanished, leaving me alone in the middle of the night. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was just the late hour playing tricks on me. But then I saw them, figures standing at the far end of the deck, barely visible in the dim light. They were still, too still, and as I walked closer, I realized something was off. Their clothes were outdated, their faces pale and expressionless. They didn't seem to notice me, their eyes fixed on the horizon as if they were waiting for something. Called out, but none of them responded. The silence was chilling, and a sense of dread began to creep over me. I turned to head back inside, but when I looked behind me, the figures had moved closer, without making a sound. Their faces were clearer now, and I could see the emptiness in their eyes. It felt like they were watching me, but not really seeing me, as if they were lost in a world of their own. Panic began to set in as I realized that I wasn't just dealing with strange passengers. These people weren't alive, not in the way I was. Ferry, once a simple means of transportation, had become a ghostly vessel, carrying more than just the living. I needed to get off the boat, but we were in the middle of the water, far from any shore. The only option was to wait it out, hoping the ferry would reach its destination soon. But the ride seemed to stretch on endlessly, the minutes ticking by with agonizing slowness. The figures continued to move closer, their presence growing more oppressive with each passing moment. I retreated to the cabin, locking the door behind me, but it did little to ease my fear. The ferry felt alive with an eerie energy, and I could hear faint whispers in the corridors, as if the spirits were trying to communicate. The temperature dropped suddenly, and I could see my breath in the cold air. The windows fogged up, and when I wiped them clear, I saw something that made my blood run cold. More figures, standing on the water, their ghostly forms illuminated by the faint moonlight. They were watching the ferry, their eyes locked on mine, as if waiting for me to join them. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. The ferry creaked and groaned, and I could feel it slowing down. But when I looked outside again, there was no land in sight, just an endless expanse of dark water. The figures on the deck were now just outside the cabin door, their ghostly hands reaching for the handle. I knew I couldn't stay here any longer. With no other choice, I ran out onto the deck, pushing past the ghostly passengers and heading for the lifeboats. My hands shook as I lowered one into the water, and I didn't look back as I climbed in and paddled away. The ferry drifted farther into the night, its ghostly passengers still aboard, watching as I escaped into the darkness. When I finally reached the shore, the ferry was nowhere to be seen. It was as if it had never existed, a ghostly vessel lost to the sea. I'll never forget that night, the chilling presence of those lost souls, and the haunting realization that not all passengers make it to their destination. Our road trip through the desert was supposed to be an adventure, a journey through wide-open spaces and endless horizons. But as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the barren landscape, we found ourselves in a small town that didn't appear on any map. The streets were empty, the buildings worn and weathered by time, and an eerie silence hung in the air. We needed gas and supplies, so we decided to stop, unaware of the chilling welcome that awaited us. The townspeople were strange, quiet, too quiet, with eyes that seemed to follow us wherever we went. Their smiles never reached their eyes, and their conversations were laced with cryptic warnings. Something about the place felt off, like a forgotten corner of the world where the rules didn't apply. The more we explored, the more uneasy we became, but by then, it was too late to leave. As night fell, the town took on a haunting quality. The streets, once bathed in golden light, were now shrouded in darkness, and the oppressive silence grew heavier. We tried to find a way out, but every road seemed to lead us back to the center of town. Panic set in as we realized we were trapped, and the townspeople, once merely strange, now seemed sinister. They watched us with cold, calculating eyes, as if deciding our fate. The sense of dread intensified when we discovered that the gas station was empty. No fuel, no attendants, just an eerie quiet. The town seemed to close in around us, the buildings leaning closer, their windows like dark, hollow eyes. Townspeople appeared out of the shadows, surrounding us with unsettling smiles. They spoke in hushed tones, their words filled with chilling implication. Desperate, we tried to leave on foot, but the desert stretched on endlessly in every direction. No matter how far we walked, town always loomed ahead, waiting for us to return. The night was cold, and the wind whispered strange things in our ears. The townspeople followed us, their footsteps silent on the sand, their presence a constant, haunting reminder that we weren't meant to leave. Finally, we gave in, returning to the town, exhausted and defeated. The townspeople welcomed us back with eerie smiles, leading us to a small, decrepit motel. The rooms were old and musty, filled with a sense of abandonment. We locked ourselves inside, hoping to survive the night. The feeling of being watched never left. The shadows seemed to move on their own, and the silence was deafening. As the hours dragged on, sleep became impossible. The night was filled with strange noises, whispers, scratching, and the distant sound of footsteps. It felt like the walls were closing in on us, trapping us in a nightmare we couldn't escape. By morning, we were exhausted, but the townspeople were still there, waiting with those same eerie smiles. We finally found a way out, though we never understood how. The road that had trapped us now led us back to the highway, and we didn't stop driving until the town was far behind us. But the memory of that place lingers, a chilling reminder of how quickly an adventure can turn into a nightmare. We've never spoken of it since, but the fear it left behind is something we'll never forget. The lake was supposed to be a peaceful escape, a romantic getaway in a secluded spot far from the chaos of everyday life. We rented a canoe, eager to explore the calm waters and enjoy the solitude. The morning started off perfectly, the sun shining and the water smooth as glass. But as we paddled deeper into the lake, a sense of unease began to creep in, and the shadows around us seemed to grow longer. It started with the feeling of being watched. At first, we thought it was just our imagination. After all, we were the only ones on the lake. But then we saw them, strange figures standing on the shore, their silhouettes barely visible through the trees. They didn't move, just stood there, watching us with an intensity that sent chills down our spines. We tried to ignore them, focusing on the beauty of the lake. The unease lingered. As we paddled farther from the shore, the water began to change. The surface, once calm and clear, grew darker, almost black, as if something was lurking beneath. The figures on the shore remained still, but their presence was suffocating, a constant reminder that we weren't alone. The air grew heavy, and the once bright day took on a haunting quality, the sunlight dimming as if filtered through a veil of shadows. Then the water started to ripple, small waves forming around the canoe. We looked around, but there was no wind, no reason for the disturbance. The ripples grew stronger, and the canoe began to rock, making it harder to paddle. Panic set in as we realized that something was following us, something just beneath the surface. We tried to turn back, but the shore seemed farther away than before, and the figures were still there, waiting. The water around us grew more turbulent, and we saw glimpses of something dark and massive moving beneath the surface. Every time it surfaced, the canoe rocked violently, nearly tipping us into the lake. The figures on the shore were closer now, their eyes gleaming in the dim light. We paddled frantically, trying to escape the unseen force that was pursuing us, but the lake had become a maze of shadows and terror. Finally, with one last desperate effort, we reached the shore, collapsing on the bank, gasping for breath. The figures were gone, vanished into the trees, but the memory of their haunting presence remained. The lake, once a place of beauty and peace, had turned into a nightmare that we barely escaped. We left that place as quickly as we could, never looking back, the shadows still lingering in our minds. Working late in the office wasn't unusual for me. Quiet hours after everyone else had gone home were often the most productive. But that night was different. The building felt emptier than usual, fluorescent lights casting eerie shadows across the deserted desks. The silence was thick, broken only by the occasional hum of the air conditioning. I told myself it was just another late night, but as the hours dragged on, a chilling presence began to settle over the office. It started with the footstep. Soft at first, almost imperceptible, but growing louder with each passing minute. At first, I thought it was the cleaning crew. But when I checked, the halls were empty. The footsteps seemed to echo through the building, coming from every direction and nowhere at once. My nerves were on edge, every creak and rustle sending shivers down my spine. Then the lights began to flicker, casting the office in and out of darkness. I tried to focus on my work, but the sense of unease was overwhelming. Footsteps returned, closer this time, and I could feel eyes on me, watching, waiting. The office, once a familiar and comfortable space, had transformed into something sinister, a place where the shadows seemed to hide more than just darkness. Desperate for a break, I decided to grab a coffee from the break room. But as I walked through the empty halls, the sense of being followed grew stronger. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, lurking in the shadows. But the halls were always empty, the only sound my own footsteps echoing in the silence. In the break room, the coffee machine gurgled ominously as it brewed. I leaned against the counter, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that clung to me like a second skin. That's when I heard it. A soft, eerie whisper, too close for comfort. My heart raced as I spun around, but there was no one there. The whispers continued, growing louder, more insistent, filling the room with a chilling presence. I fled back to my desk, determined to finish my work and leave as quickly as possible. But the office wasn't done with me yet. The lights flickered again, plunging the room into darkness. The footsteps returned, heavy and deliberate, and this time I knew they were coming for me. I grabbed my things and bolted for the door, the sense of dread now a suffocating weight. As I reached the exit, I glanced back one last time and saw a figure standing at the end of the hall, its form shrouded in shadow. It didn't move, just watched me with cold, empty eyes. I didn't wait to find out what it wanted. I fled into the night, the oppressive silence of the office still echoing in my ears. That was the last time I stayed late at work. The haunting presence of that night, a constant reminder that some places are better left in the light. It was supposed to be a quick detour, a shortcut that would save me time on my way home. The road was empty, a narrow strip of asphalt cutting through the dense woods. Instruction signs were old and faded, and I assumed the work had long since been completed. As I drove deeper into the forest, the trees closed in around me, their branches casting eerie shadows across the road. It wasn't long before I realized I had made a terrible mistake. The first sign of trouble came when I hit a patch of rough gravel. The road, once smooth and well-paved, had turned into a treacherous path full of potholes and debris. I slowed down, trying to navigate the uneven terrain, but the deeper I went, the worse it got. The forest grew darker, the trees towering over me like silent sentinels. The feeling of isolation was overwhelming, and I couldn't shake the sense that I was being watched. Then I saw them. Strange figures standing just off the road, their faces hidden in the shadows. They didn't move, just stood there, watching as I passed by. My heart raced as I sped up, desperate to get away from them. The road seemed to stretch on forever. Every turn I took led me deeper into the woods, and the figures appeared again and again, always just out of reach, always watching. Panic set in as I realized I was lost. Road signs had disappeared, and the construction barriers were now twisted and broken, as if something had torn through them. I tried to turn back, but the road had changed, twisting and turning in ways that made no sense. The figures were closer now, their presence suffocating, and I could feel their cold eyes on me, tracking my every move. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, my car's engine sputtered and died. I was stranded in the middle of the forest, with no cell signal and no way out. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of my own breathing. Figures stepped closer, emerging from the shadows, their faces pale and expressionless. They circled the car, their eyes gleaming in the darkness. Desperate, I tried to restart the engine, but it was no use. Figures were right outside now, their hands pressed against the windows, their breath fogging up the glass. I locked the doors, my heart pounding in my chest, but I knew it wouldn't be enough. The road, forest, figures. It was all a trap, and I had fallen right into it. As the figures closed in, the forest seemed to come alive, the trees creaking and groaning as they bent toward the car. The air grew thick with the scent of decay, and the darkness pressed in from all sides. I knew I had to get out, but there was nowhere to go. The road had led me to this place, and now it wasn't going to let me leave. Halloween had always been our favorite time of year, a night filled with spooky fun and harmless pranks. This year we decided to up the ante and pull off the ultimate scare. The old abandoned asylum on the edge of town was the perfect setting. Its crumbling walls and eerie atmosphere made it the stuff of nightmares. We gathered our supplies, dressed in our best costumes, and headed out, eager to scare the pants off anyone brave enough to follow us inside. The asylum loomed over us as we approached, its windows dark and lifeless, the air thick with the scent of decay. Front gate was rusted and broken, swinging open with a low, chilling creak. We laughed nervously as we made our way inside, crunch of leaves underfoot, the only sound in the stillness. The asylum was just as we had imagined, dark, creepy, and full of potential for the perfect Halloween prank. We set up our traps, hiding speakers in the walls to create eerie sounds, and scattered fake blood and props throughout the halls. It was all in good fun, or so we thought, but as the night wore on, the asylum began to feel different. Darker, colder, as if the walls themselves were closing in on us. The laughter faded, replaced by an unsettling silence that hung heavy in the air. Then we heard it, a low, guttural moan echoing through the halls. At first, we thought it was one of our traps, but when we checked, everything was in place. The sound came again, closer this time, and with it, the unmistakable shuffle of footsteps. Panic set in as we realized we weren't alone in the asylum. Something or someone was with us, and it wasn't part of our prank. We tried to leave, but the asylum seemed to have other plans. The halls twisted and turned, leading us in circles. Exits always just out of reach. The moans grew louder, more insistent, and the footsteps followed us wherever we went. Props we had set up, once just harmless decorations, now seemed to come alive, their shadows stretching across the walls, haunting us with every step. Desperation set in as we stumbled through the dark, our flashlights flickering and dying one by one. The asylum had become a labyrinth of terror, and we were trapped inside its twisted embrace. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and the moans turned into chilling whispers that echoed in our ears. Felt like the very walls were watching us, feeding off our fear. Just when we thought we couldn't take it anymore, we found the exit. We burst through the doors, gasping for breath, our hearts pounding in our chests. But the relief was short-lived. As we looked back at the asylum, we saw them, figures standing in the windows, watching us with cold, empty eyes. The prank had gone horribly wrong, and whatever we had awakened inside that asylum wasn't going to let us forget. The ancient castle had always fascinated us, a relic of a bygone era perched high on a cliff overlooking the sea. When we heard it was open for tours, we jumped at the chance to explore its dark halls and hidden chambers. The tour guide regaled us with stories of the castle's haunted past, tales of ghostly apparitions, and mysterious disappearances. We laughed it off, eager to see the castle for ourselves. But as the tour ended, we found ourselves locked inside, trapped in a place that didn't want us to leave. At first, we thought it was a mistake. We tried the doors, but they wouldn't budge. The windows were sealed shut, the thick stone walls blocking out any sound from the outside world. Panic set in as we realized we were alone in the castle, with no way out. The once grand halls now seemed cold and foreboding, the air heavy with a sense of dread. As we searched for an escape, we noticed strange things. Flickering light in a distant tower, a door that creaked open on its own, and whispers that echoed through the empty rooms. The castle, once just a piece of history, had come alive with a haunting presence. Every step we took seemed to lead us deeper into its dark embrace, the shadows growing longer, the air colder. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and we could feel eyes on us, watching, waiting. The castle was filled with hidden passages and secret rooms, but every turn we took only seemed to lead us farther from the exit. The old stories of hauntings and disappearances no longer seemed so far-fetched. It was as if the castle itself was keeping us there, holding us in a place where time had no meaning. Desperation took over as we searched for a way out. The walls seemed to close in on us, the whispers turning into sinister laughter. We could hear footsteps behind us, but every time we turned around, there was no one there. The castle had become a maze of shadows and terror, and we were trapped inside, with no hope of escape. Finally, after what felt like hours, we found a hidden staircase leading down to the dungeon. The air was thick with the scent of damp stone and decay, and the darkness was suffocating. But it was our only way out. We descended into the depths of the castle, the walls pressing in on us, the whispers growing louder with every step. When we finally emerged, we found ourselves outside. Cold night air a welcome relief. Castle loomed behind us, its dark silhouette against the sky, a haunting reminder of what we had just escaped. We didn't look back as we made our way down the cliff, the memory of that night forever etched in our minds. The castle had let us go, but its secrets remained buried within its ancient walls. I was on a long road trip, driving through the middle of nowhere, when my fuel gauge dipped dangerously low. There wasn't much around, just miles of empty road and the occasional tumbleweed. Relief washed over me when I finally spotted a small, rundown gas station in the distance. The place looked like it hadn't seen a customer in years, but I had no choice. I pulled in, the old pump creaking as I stepped out of the car. As I began filling up the tank, I noticed the two attendants behind the counter inside. They were whispering to each other, casting quick, nervous glances my way. Chill ran down my spine, but I tried to shake it off. Maybe they just weren't used to seeing people out here in the middle of nowhere. I finished fueling up and walked inside to pay, the doorbell jingling eerily in the silence. The moment I stepped in, the atmosphere shifted. The air was thick with tension, and the attendants stopped whispering, their eyes locking onto me with unsettling intensity. I forced a smile, trying to act normal, but every instinct screamed at me to leave. As I handed over my money, I noticed the door behind the counter slightly ajar, revealing a dark, shadowy room beyond. Curiosity got the better of me, and I glanced toward the door, hoping to get a better look. That's when I saw it. A glimpse of something chilling, something that shouldn't have been there. The attendants quickly shut the door, their expressions turning cold. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized I'd seen something I wasn't supposed to. I had to get out of there and fast. I mumbled a quick thanks and turned to leave, but the attendants didn't move. Their eyes followed me, and I could feel their sinister intention, like a weight pressing down on me. My hand trembled as I reached for the door, cool night air barely calming my racing thoughts. As soon as I stepped outside, I sprinted to my car, fumbling with the keys in my haste to escape. The engine roared to life, and I slammed on the gas, the tires screeching as I sped away from the station. In the rearview mirror, I saw the attendants step outside, their figures silhouetted against the dim lights. They watched me go, their expressions unreadable, but I knew they weren't just harmless attendants. They had been plotting something, and I had narrowly escaped. As I drove away, the eerie feeling clung to me, the memory of their cold stares etched in my mind. The road stretched out before me, but the sense of safety I'd once felt behind the wheel was gone. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still watching, still waiting for another chance to trap me in their twisted game. Eventually, the gas station faded into the distance, but the haunting memory remained. I'll never forget that night, the way the air seemed to thicken with danger. The chilling sense that I'd narrowly escaped something far worse than I could imagine. It was a reminder that not all help comes with good intentions, and sometimes the most ordinary places can hide the darkest secret. It had been a long day on the road, and all I wanted was a decent place to sleep. When I saw the flickering neon sign for a motel up ahead, I sighed with relief. The place looked run down, the kind of motel that hadn't been renovated in decades, but it was better than nothing. The clerk behind the counter barely looked up as I checked in, handing me a key with a number worn smooth from years of use. I was too tired to care. All I wanted was a bed. The hallway leading to my room was dimly lit, carpet frayed and stained. Every step seemed to echo unnervingly, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. When I finally reached my room, I quickly locked the door behind me, trying to push away the eerie sensation that had settled in my chest. The room was just as run down as the rest of the motel: faded wallpaper, a flickering light, and a bed that creaked ominously when I sat on it. Exhaustion tugged at me, but sleep didn't come easily. Every little noise seemed amplified. Creak of the floorboards, the faint rustling outside my door. My nerves were on edge, and I couldn't help but feel like I wasn't alone. When I finally drifted off, it wasn't long before I was jolted awake by the sound of footsteps in the hallway, heavy and deliberate. I held my breath, listening as the footsteps stopped outside my door. The handle rattled slightly, as if someone was testing it. My heart pounded in my chest, but I didn't move, didn't make a sound. Whoever, or whatever, was outside eventually moved on, footsteps fading into the distance. I let out a shaky breath. The sense of unease didn't leave. The next morning, I decided to check out early. As I was packing up, I noticed something odd. There were no other cars in the parking lot. It was as if I was the only guest in the entire motel. The clerk from the night before was gone, replaced by an older woman with a cold, distant stare. She barely acknowledged me as I handed over the key, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she knew something I didn't. As I drove away, I glanced back at the motel, the neon sign flickering weakly in the morning light. That's when I saw them. Figures standing in the windows of the rooms, watching me leave. They were barely visible, shadows behind the dirty glass, but I knew they were there. My stomach twisted with dread as I realized that those weren't just other guests. The road stretched out before me, but I couldn't stop thinking about the motel and the eerie figures in the window. I'd checked in hoping for a place to rest, but I'd stumbled into something far more sinister. The thought of what might have happened if I'd stayed another night sent chills down my spine. By the time the motel disappeared from my rearview mirror, I'd made up my mind. I'd never stay in a place like that again. Haunting feeling of being watched, the unsettling silence of the empty halls, was all too much. That night had cost me more than just a room fee. It had left me with a memory I couldn't shake, a reminder that some places are better left unexplored. I'd been driving for hours, the desert stretching endlessly around me, when I spotted the small diner up ahead. The neon sign flickered weakly, casting an eerie glow over the dusty parking lot. I was starving, and the promise of a hot meal was too tempting to pass up, so I pulled in and parked. As I stepped inside, the bell over the door jingled, and a few heads turned my way. The place was nearly empty. just a handful of patrons scattered at the worn-out booths. Something felt off from the moment I walked in. The air was thick, almost stifling, and the other customers seemed to be watching me a little too closely. They were all older, their clothes outdated, their expressions unreadable. I tried to ignore it, sliding into a booth and picking up the sticky menu. The waitress appeared out of nowhere, her smile too wide, too forced, as she asked what I wanted. I ordered a simple meal, but the unease never left. The other patrons kept glancing my way, whispering to each other in low voices. The sound of their murmurs made my skin crawl. I couldn't quite make out what they were saying. I kept telling myself it was just a small-town diner, that people were curious about outsiders, but deep down, I knew there was more to it than that. When the food arrived, I couldn't bring myself to eat it. The smell was off, the eggs too rubbery, the coffee too bitter. My stomach churned as I pushed the plate away, and that's when I noticed it. There was no sound outside. No cars, no wind, just an eerie silence that pressed in from all sides. It was as if the diner was the only place left in the world. I decided to leave, but when I got up to pay, the cashier, a man with hollow eyes and a slow, deliberate voice, refused my money. "Stay a while," he said, his words dripping with something I couldn't quite place. My heart raced as I backed away, suddenly desperate to get out of there. The other customers were watching me again, their eyes narrowing as if they knew something I didn't. I rushed to the door, but when I stepped outside, town was gone. The diner stood alone, surrounded by nothing but the endless desert. Panic surged through me as I realized there was no way out. The road I'd driven in on had vanished, and the horizon stretched on forever, barren and lifeless. That's when they started to come outside, patrons from the diner, their faces twisted into something unrecognizable. They moved slowly, deliberately, like predators closing in on their prey. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking as I tried to unlock the car. The air was thick with tension, the silence deafening as they drew closer. Finally, I managed to start the car, the engine roaring to life as I peeled out of the parking lot. But the diner never disappeared from my rearview mirror. It stayed there, looming on the horizon no matter how far I drove. Roads stretched endlessly before me, but I couldn't escape the haunting presence of that diner or the eerie figures that still watched from its windows. I've never spoken of what happened that night, but the memory lingers. Constant reminder of the chilling emptiness of that deserted diner. Some places, I've learned, are meant to trap you, and once they have you, they never let go. I was trying to avoid traffic, so I took an unfamiliar exit off the highway. The GPS had been acting up all day, so I figured a detour through some quiet back roads might be the quickest way around the jam. At first, the route seemed perfect. Empty roads, peaceful scenery, and not a single car in sight. But as I drove deeper into the countryside, something didn't feel right. The road narrowed, the trees closing in around me like a dark tunnel. And then I saw the sign, "Welcome to Black Hollow." Town appeared out of nowhere, a cluster of old buildings huddled together beneath a gray sky. It felt deserted, the streets empty, and the windows dark. I slowed down, peering through the windshield at the worn-out storefronts and crumbling houses. There wasn't a soul in sight, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My instincts told me to turn back. Curiosity got the better of me, so I pressed on. The further I drove, the worse the feeling got. The town seemed frozen in time, like a relic from the past. The air was thick with an eerie stillness, broken only by the creak of old signs swaying in the wind. I glanced down at my phone, hoping for some signal. The screen was blank. No bars, no GPS, nothing. That's when I noticed my car was slowing down, despite my foot pressing firmly on the gas. Panic set in as the engine sputtered and died, leaving me stranded in the middle of this ghost town. I tried to restart it, but the engine just wheezed and clicked, refusing to turn over. I was stuck. As I sat there, trying to figure out what to do, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. A figure stood at the end of the street, just barely visible through the fog that had begun to roll in. The figure didn't move, didn't approach, just watched me. My heart pounded as I realized there were more of them, stepping out of the shadows, their faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats and hooded cloaks. They gathered silently, their presence suffocating as they formed a circle around my car. There was no way out, no escape. I locked the doors, my hands trembling as I tried to think of a plan. The townspeople, or whatever they were, began to close in, their eyes gleaming with something dark and malevolent. I could hear their whispers now, soft and chilling, carried on the wind. They spoke of rituals, of sacrifices, things better left unknown. My mind raced as I searched for anything that could help me. But there was nothing, just the overwhelming fear that I was trapped. Desperate, I tried to make a run for it, but the moment I stepped out of the car, they were on me. Cold hands grabbed my arms, their grip like iron, as they dragged me toward the town square. The air grew colder, fog thicker, and the shadows longer, as they led me to a weathered stone altar in the center of the square. I struggled, but it was no use. Their whispers filled my ears, a haunting chorus of ancient words. Just as I thought it was over, a flash of lightning split the sky, and the townspeople froze. In that brief moment of confusion, I broke free, stumbling away from the altar and back to my car. I didn't look back as I fumbled with the keys, the engine miraculously roaring to life on the first try. I sped out of Black Hollow, the eerie town disappearing in my rearview mirror. I've never been able to find that exit again, and I've never spoken of what happened. But the memory of that night, those cold, watchful eyes and the sinister whispers, still haunts me. I've learned my lesson. Some detours aren't worth the shortcut. It was getting late, and I'd been driving for hours when I decided to pull over at a rest stop deep in the woods. The place was eerily quiet, just a few scattered cars and the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the parking lot, and a strange feeling settled over me as I stepped out of the car. There was something off about the place, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I headed for the restroom, trying to shake off the unease, but the closer I got, the worse it felt. The air was thick with a strange tension, and the usual sounds of nature seemed muted, almost absent. That's when I heard it, a soft chanting, barely audible but unmistakably there, drifting through the trees. Curiosity tugged at me, and against my better judgment, I followed the sound. The chanting grew louder as I made my way through the woods, my footsteps barely making a sound on the soft earth. Trees loomed overhead, their branches twisting together like skeletal fingers. My heart raced as I approached a small clearing, the source of the chanting just ahead. I crouched behind a thick tree, peering out into the clearing, and what I saw sent chills down my spine. A group of people, dressed in long, dark robes, stood in a circle around a stone altar. Their faces were hidden by hoods, and their voices rose and fell in a haunting, rhythmic chant. On the altar lay something, or someone, covered in a white sheet, motionless and silent. The air was thick with the scent of burning incense, and the shadows seemed to dance around the clearing, as if alive. Panic surged through me as I realized what I'd stumbled upon. I had to get out of there before they noticed me. But just as I turned to leave, a twig snapped underfoot, the sound echoing unnaturally loud in the stillness. The chanting stopped abruptly, and the robed figures turned as one, their eyes locking onto me with chilling intensity. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away, desperate to escape. They didn't speak, didn't shout, just started moving toward me, their footsteps silent and deliberate. I ran, crashing through the underbrush, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The trees seemed to close in around me, the branches clawing at my skin as I tried to find my way back to the car. But no matter how fast I ran, I could feel them behind me, closing in with every step. Finally, I burst out of the woods and into the parking lot, my car a welcome sight in the fading light. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking, and jumped into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, and I sped out of the rest area, not daring to look back. My heart was still racing, my mind spinning with what I'd just seen. The chanting echoed in my ears, a haunting reminder of how close I'd come to being part of that ritual. As the miles passed and the forest receded into the distance, I tried to convince myself it had been a nightmare, trick of the mind. but the memory of those dark, hooded figures and their eerie chant stayed with me. A chilling reminder that some places should be avoided at all costs. I've never stopped at a rest area in the woods again, and I never will. It was a lonely stretch of road, the kind where you could drive for miles without seeing another car. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the landscape, and I was starting to feel the fatigue of a long day on the road. That's when I saw him, a hitchhiker, standing by the side of the road, his thumb outstretched, and a worn backpack slung over his shoulder. Something about him made me hesitate, but the road was empty, and I felt a pang of guilt at the thought of leaving him there. I slowed down, rolling down the window as I pulled up beside him. He was a tall, gaunt man, his clothes dusty and his face hidden beneath the brim of a wide hat. He looked up as I approached, and for a moment I thought I saw something in his eyes, something dark and unsettling. But he smiled, friendly enough smile, and I found myself unlocking the door. He slid into the passenger seat with a quiet, "Thanks," and we set off down the road. At first, the conversation was normal enough. Where he was headed, where I was coming from, but there was something off about the way he spoke. A strange cadence to his words that made my skin crawl. He seemed to know things he shouldn't. Little details about me that I hadn't mentioned. The more he talked, the more uneasy I felt. As the miles passed, the sun dipped below the horizon, and the road ahead grew darker. The hitchhiker's tone shifted, his questions becoming more personal, more probing. He asked about my family, my job, things that made me uncomfortable. I tried to steer the conversation back to safer topics, but he kept circling back, his gaze never leaving me. It wasn't long before I started to feel trapped. The road stretched endlessly ahead, and my mind raced with thoughts of how to get out of this situation. I glanced at the hitchhiker out of the corner of my eye, trying to gauge his intentions, but his expression was unreadable. The friendly smile had faded, replaced by something colder, more calculating. Then, he said something that made my blood run cold. He mentioned a detail about my life that I hadn't told him, something only someone close to me would know. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized this wasn't just a chance encounter. He knew who I was, and he had a reason for being here. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. I knew I had to get him out of the car, but I didn't want to provoke him. So I played along, pretending everything was fine, while my mind raced with escape plan. Finally, I saw a gas station up ahead, a small, dimly lit place that felt like a lifeline. I pulled in, making up an excuse about needing to fill up, and he nodded, his eyes never leaving me. As soon as I stopped the car, I made my move. I jumped out, pretending to head toward the pump, but instead, I ran inside the gas station, my heart pounding in my chest. The attendant looked up in surprise, and I quickly explained the situation. He nodded grimly and reached for the phone, while I watched through the window as the hitchhiker sat in the car, his face expressionless. By the time the police arrived, the hitchhiker was gone. He'd left the car without a trace, disappearing into the night as if he'd never been there. Police searched the area, but they found nothing. No sign of him. No clues as to who he was or what he wanted. But I knew the truth. He hadn't just been a hitchhiker. He'd known too much, and he'd had a plan. To this day, I still don't know what his intentions were, but the memory of that night haunts me. I've never picked up another hitchhiker since, and I always keep my doors locked when I'm on the road. You never know who you might meet out there, or what they might be hiding. I was on a road trip, taking the scenic route through the countryside, when I stumbled upon it, a ghost town in the middle of nowhere. The sign on the outskirts read, "Welcome to Hollow Creek," but it looked like no one had lived there in decades. The buildings were old and crumbling, the streets overgrown with weeds. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to stop and explore, figuring it would make for an interesting detour. As I stepped out of the car, the air was thick with an eerie silence, broken only by the soft rustling of the wind through the trees. The town seemed completely deserted. Not a soul in sight. I wandered down the main street, peering into the dusty windows of the abandoned shops. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows that made the town feel even more deserted. But as I walked further in, I began to notice things that didn't quite add up. There were signs of recent activity, footprints in the dirt, a door slightly ajar, and a faint smell of smoke lingering in the air. My heart started to race as I realized I might not be alone. The feeling of being watched crept over me, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. But there was no one, just the empty buildings and the unsettling silence. I continued exploring, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease. The town was larger than I'd expected, with narrow alleys and winding streets that seemed to go on forever. I came across an old church, its doors wide open, and against my better judgment, I decided to go inside. The air was cold and musty, wooden pews covered in a thick layer of dust, but as I stepped further in, I heard it. A soft whisper, barely audible, but unmistakably there. My pulse quickened, and I froze, straining to hear. The whispering grew louder, more distinct, like multiple voices speaking at once. Couldn't understand what they were saying, but the tone was chilling, filled with a sense of urgency. I spun around, expecting to see someone behind me. The church was empty. The whispers seemed to come from all around me, echoing off the walls. Panic set in, and I bolted out of the church, my footsteps echoing loudly in the stillness. As I made my way back to the main street, I noticed something even more unsettling. The town had changed. The buildings, once old and decayed, now looked almost new, as if they had been restored in a matter of minutes. The streets were no longer overgrown, and the air was filled with the faint sound of voices and laughter. But there were no people, just shadows moving behind the windows, flickering like distorted images. My heart raced as I realized the town wasn't as abandoned as I had thought. I was surrounded by ghosts, trapped in a place where the past and present seemed to blur together. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if they were trying to tell me something, trying to keep me there. I ran back to my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I sped out of Hollow Creek, not daring to look back. The town disappeared in my rearview mirror, but the haunting feeling stayed with me. The whispers, the shadows, they were more than just tricks of the mind. They were real, and they had been trying to pull me into their world. I've never gone back to Hollow Creek, and I avoid taking back roads whenever I can. The memory of that ghost town and the chilling realization that it wasn't as empty as it seemed still haunts me. Some places are better left forgotten. There's secrets buried in the past where they belong. I was exhausted from hours of driving, so when I saw a rest area near a dense forest, I decided to pull over and stretch my legs. The place was quiet, almost too quiet, with just a few other cars parked and the thick trees looming overhead. Air was cool and fresh, a welcome break from the stuffy confines of my car. I stepped out and walked toward the edge of the forest, drawn by the sound of rustling leaves. But as I got closer, the atmosphere changed. The rustling wasn't just the wind, it was rhythmic, deliberate. My footsteps faltered as I strained to listen, and that's when I heard it. Low voices chanting in a language I couldn't understand. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly ducked behind a tree, peering into the woods. There, in a small clearing, was a group of people dressed in dark robes, gathered around a makeshift altar. They hadn't noticed me yet, but the sight of them sent chills down my spine. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding, and the longer I watched, the more certain I became that whatever they were doing wasn't just some harmless ritual. My instincts screamed at me to get out of there, but I couldn't look away. Chanting grew louder, more intense, and I could feel the power in their words, a chilling energy that seemed to pulse through the trees. Just as I was about to turn and leave, one of them looked up. Our eyes met, and in that instant, I knew I was in danger. The chanting stopped abruptly, and the group turned as one to face me, their faces hidden in the shadows of their hoods. Panic surged through me, and I bolted back toward the parking lot, my heart pounding in my chest. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees twisting and shifting as if trying to trap me. I could hear them behind me, their footsteps soft but relentless, closing the distance with terrifying speed. My mind raced as I tried to figure out what to do. My car was in sight, but the distance seemed impossibly far. Every step felt heavier, the ground shifting beneath my feet as if the forest itself was trying to stop me. The air was thick with the scent of earth and decay, and I could feel their presence growing closer. Finally, I burst out of the trees and into the parking lot, gasping for breath. I didn't dare look back as I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The engine roared to life, and I floored the gas pedal, speeding out of the rest area as fast as I could. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of them standing at the edge of the forest, watching me leave. Their silhouettes were dark and menacing, and I knew they weren't just going to let me go. For miles, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every shadow on the road seemed to stretch too long, every tree twisted in unnatural ways. The memory of those dark figures and their haunting chant echoed in my mind, and I couldn't shake the fear they'd find me again. The forest had marked me, and I knew I would never be the same. I've avoided rest areas ever since, especially those near forests. The memory of that night still lingers, a chilling reminder of what I narrowly escaped. Some places hold secrets that are better left undisturbed, and I've learned to trust my instincts when they tell me to run. I was on a road trip, enjoying the freedom of the open highway, when I decided to take a scenic detour. The main route had become monotonous, and I figured a drive through the countryside might be more interesting. The road I turned onto was narrow and winding, surrounded by tall trees that cast long shadows across the pavement. At first, it was peaceful, almost tranquil, but soon enough, that tranquility turned into something far more unsettling. As I drove, the road seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning without any signs of civilization. My GPS had lost signal, and there were no other cars in sight. The trees grew denser, their branches arching over the road like a dark tunnel. The air inside the car felt thick, heavy, and an eerie silence settled in. No birds, no wind, just the low hum of my engine and the endless stretch of road ahead. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was just my imagination. But as the minutes turned into hours and the landscape never changed, panic began to set in. The road seemed to loop back on itself, the same trees, the same bends, over and over again. I checked my watch, but it was as if time had stopped. The sun remained low on the horizon, casting an eternal dusk over everything. I pulled over to try and get my bearings, but when I stepped out of the car, the air was cold, unnaturally so. Trees loomed overhead, their branches swaying ever so slightly, despite the lack of wind. The silence was deafening, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My heart raced as I looked around, trying to find any sign of where I was, but there was nothing, just the endless road and the darkening woods. Desperate, I got back in the car and continued driving, but no matter how far I went, the road never ended. The shadows grew longer, stretching across the pavement like claws, and strange shapes seemed to move in the corners of my vision. Every turn felt the same, every stretch of road identical to the last. It was as if I was trapped in a loop, driving through a place that didn't want me to leave. Then, out of nowhere, I saw a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop just inches from them. It was a woman, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, her face pale and expressionless. She didn't move, didn't react, just stared at me with hollow eyes. My heart pounded as I realized she wasn't real, at least not in the way I understood reality. I tried to drive around her, but every time I moved, she reappeared in front of the car, her presence becoming more oppressive with each attempt. The road began to close in around me, the trees twisting into grotesque shapes, the air thick with a sense of dread. It was as if the road itself had become a trap, and the woman was its gatekeeper, refusing to let me leave. In a moment of desperation, I floored the gas pedal, driving straight through her. The car jolted violently, but when I looked back, she was gone. The road ahead was still endless, but I kept driving, fueled by fear and adrenaline, I didn't care where I ended up, I just wanted to escape. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw lights up ahead. A small town, ordinary and welcoming. I pulled into the first gas station I saw, my hands shaking as I stepped out of the car. The attendant looked at me with concern, but I couldn't bring myself to explain what had happened. I just filled up the tank and got back on the main road, vowing never to take another detour again. The memory of that vanishing road still haunts me. I've tried to find it on maps, but it doesn't exist. At least not in the way normal roads do. It was a place out of time, out of reality, and I know I barely escaped with my sanity intact. Some roads aren't meant to be traveled, and I learned that lesson the hard way. It was late, and I'd been driving for hours without a break. When I saw the sign for a rest stop up ahead, I decided it was time to pull over and stretch my legs. The place was isolated, just a small parking lot surrounded by dense trees and a few old picnic tables. The lights flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows across the asphalt. I parked my car and stepped out, breathing in the cool night air, but something about the place felt off. There were no other cars, no sounds except for the distant hum of the highway and the rustling of leaves in the wind. The silence was unsettling, and the shadows seemed to stretch too far, moving in ways that didn't make sense. I shook off the feeling, telling myself it was just my imagination, and headed for the restroom. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and the dim light inside did little to dispel the sense of unease. As I washed my hands, I heard a faint shuffling sound coming from one of the stalls. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, listening intently. The sound came again, louder this time, followed by a low, raspy breath. I backed away slowly, my pulse racing, and hurried out of the restroom without looking back. The parking lot felt even more ominous now, the shadows deeper, the silence heavier. I rushed to my car, but as I reached for the door handle, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. Figures stood at the edge of the trees, barely visible in the darkness. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized there were more of them. Shadowy figures emerging from the woods, slowly making their way toward me. Their movements were slow, deliberate, and I could feel their eyes on me, watching with an intensity that sent chills down my spine. Panic surged through me as I fumbled with my keys, my hands trembling uncontrollably. Figures drew closer, their faces hidden in the shadows, but I could sense their malevolent intent. I finally managed to unlock the door and jumped inside, locking it behind me. The engine roared to life, and I slammed on the gas, speeding out of the rest stop as fast as I could. In the rearview mirror, I saw them standing in the middle of the parking lot, watching me leave. But as I drove away, I realized the road didn't look familiar. The signs, the landmarks, they were all wrong. It was as if I'd taken a wrong turn, but I knew I hadn't. The road stretched endlessly before me, and no matter how far I drove, couldn't find my way back to the highway. The shadows seemed to follow me, lurking just beyond the reach of my headlights. Hours passed, and the night grew darker, the silence more oppressive. I was completely lost, trapped on a road that shouldn't exist. The memory of those figures at the rest stop haunted me, their eerie presence lingering in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, waiting for me to stop again, waiting to finish what they'd started. Finally, I saw a sign up ahead, another rest stop, identical to the one I'd left behind. My heart sank as I realized I was back where I'd started. The same flickering lights, the same ominous trees, and the same chilling sense of being watched. I didn't dare stop this time. I kept driving, hoping that somehow I'd find my way out of this nightmare. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was trapped, caught in a loop that I couldn't escape. The last stop had become my only stop, a place where the shadows never left and the night never ended. I was driving alone late at night, hoping to make it through another stretch of highway before exhaustion set in. The road was eerily empty. The only sound was the hum of my engine and the occasional rustling of trees as the wind picked up. When I saw a sign for a rest stop a few miles ahead, I figured it was a good place to take a quick break. Little did I know, that stop would become a chilling memory I could never shake. The rest area was almost deserted, just a couple of dim lights flickering in the distance. As I parked, a wave of unease washed over me, but I brushed it off as fatigue. I stepped out, stretching my legs, and noticed a group of figures huddled near the edge of the lot, just barely visible in the shadows. Something about them felt wrong, too still, too silent. As I walked toward the restroom, I could feel their eyes on me. It wasn't just paranoia, there was a palpable tension in the air. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me. The eerie feeling persisted. Inside, the sound of dripping water echoed off the tiles, amplifying my growing fear. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. When I stepped back outside, the figures were gone. That didn't ease my nerves. My car felt like a sanctuary, and I quickly made my way back, ready to leave this place behind. As I reached for the door handle, I heard a soft, chilling whisper, too close for comfort. I spun around, but no one was there. Panic set in, and I fumbled with my keys. Just as I was about to get in the car, I noticed movement in my rearview mirror. The figures were back, and this time, they were closer, much closer. My heart raced as I realized they were surrounding me, blocking any chance of escape. The air grew heavy with dread, and I could see their sinister intentions in the way they moved, slowly closing in on me. With quick thinking, I dove into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut just in time. My hands shook as I started the engine. The figures were already at the windows, tapping in a slow, haunting rhythm. Their faces were obscured by the darkness, but I could feel their malevolence seeping through the glass. I threw the car into reverse, desperate to get away. The tires screeched as I backed out, narrowly missing one of them. They didn't chase me, but their eerie presence lingered in the air as I sped away. My heart pounded as I glanced in the mirror, watching them fade into the distance. Couldn't believe what had just happened. Had I really escaped? Even miles down the road, the fear clung to me like a second skin. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still watching, waiting for another chance. Every shadow seemed to harbor a threat. Every noise a signal of their return. The rest of the drive was a blur, adrenaline fueling my need to get as far away as possible. When I finally reached a well-lit gas station, I parked under the bright lights and locked the doors, taking deep breaths to calm my racing heart. Chilling encounter replayed in my mind, each detail more haunting than the last. I knew I would never forget that rest stop, nor the sinister figures that almost claimed me. Now, whenever I pass a sign for a rest area, I think twice before stopping. The memory of that night remains vivid. Constant reminder of how quickly a peaceful drive can turn into a nightmare. It's a story I rarely tell. The fear it left behind never truly fades. Our camping trip started like any other, full of excitement, laughter, and the promise of a peaceful retreat in nature. We set up our tents in a secluded spot by the lake, far from any other campers. The sun was just beginning to set, casting an orange glow over the water, and we couldn't have asked for a more serene setting. Little did we know, the night would soon take a chilling turn. As darkness fell, we gathered around the campfire, sharing stories and roasting marshmallows. It wasn't long before we noticed something eerie, a strange, almost imperceptible rustling in the bushes nearby. At first, we brushed it off as an animal. The sound persisted, growing closer with each passing minute. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. We tried to ignore it, but the atmosphere had shifted. The once peaceful campsite now felt oppressive, as if we were being watched. Then we found the first sign, crudely carved symbol on a tree near our tents. It wasn't there when we arrived, and none of us had seen or heard anyone approach. A sense of dread settled over us like a heavy fog. One of my friends suggested it was just a prank. Deep down, we all knew better. The symbol felt too deliberate, too ominous. We decided to stay close to the fire, flickering light offering a small sense of security. But as the night wore on, we realized that whatever or whoever had marked the tree wasn't done with us yet. Around midnight, we heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, and far too close for comfort. We froze, barely daring to breathe. Footsteps circled our campsite, but no one could see who or what was making them. It was as if the darkness itself had come alive, taunting us with its haunting presence. Our nerves were frayed, and the night seemed to stretch on forever. Unable to bear the tension any longer, one of my friends called out into the darkness, demanding whoever it was to show themselves. The only response was silence, thick, suffocating silence. Then, without warning, our fire was extinguished, plunging us into complete darkness. Panic set in as we scrambled to relight it, our hands shaking with fear. When the fire finally flickered back to life, we were met with another horrifying sight. More symbols had been carved into the trees around us, and this time they were accompanied by small, eerie totems hanging from the branches. It was clear that we were being stalked, toyed with, and the realization chilled us to the bone. We made the decision to leave, but as we packed up, footsteps returned, louder and more insistent. Felt like a race against time, the darkness pressing in on us from all sides. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent our hearts racing. We couldn't shake the feeling that we were being hunted. Escape seemed less and less likely. Finally, we made a break for it, abandoning what we couldn't carry and rushing to our cars. The drive back to civilization was tense. Every shadow along the road a reminder of the terror we just endured. We didn't stop until we reached the safety of a gas station, where the bright lights felt like a lifeline in the night. Even now, the memory of that night haunts us. We've never been able to explain what happened, and none of us have returned to that campsite. The experience left a lasting mark, a reminder that nature can be as eerie and unforgiving as it is beautiful. Sometimes, the woods hold secrets that are better left undisturbed. I've always been drawn to the eerie allure of abandoned places, so when I heard about an old house on the outskirts of town, I couldn't resist the urge to explore it. It was rumored to have been empty for decades, forgotten by time, and left to decay. But as I stepped onto the creaking porch, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't the first to visit, and that something still lingered inside. The front door was slightly ajar, as if inviting me in. I pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest, and was immediately hit by a wave of musty air. The house was dark, the only light filtering through cracked windows covered in grime. Dust danced in the faint beams, giving the place an almost ethereal, haunted quality. It was exactly what I had hoped for, until I noticed the footprints. They were faint but unmistakable, leading deeper into the house. My curiosity battled with a growing sense of unease as I followed them, each step echoing in the silence. Floors creaked underfoot, and the shadows seemed to shift in the corners of my vision. I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. As I explored, I found signs that the house wasn't as abandoned as it seemed. The footprints led to a room at the end of the hall, where I discovered a makeshift bed made of old blankets and newspapers. There were half-eaten cans of food scattered around, and the air was thick with a foul, rotting smell. Someone or something had been living here, and it clearly didn't want to be found. Just as I was about to leave, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. A soft, eerie shuffling from the floor above. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked up, straining to hear more. The sound grew louder, closer, as if whatever was up there was aware of my presence. I knew I should leave, but I was rooted to the spot, frozen by fear and curiosity. Suddenly, the shuffling stopped, replaced by a deafening silence that pressed down on me from all sides. I held my breath, waiting for whatever was coming next. Then, out of nowhere, a chilling whisper echoed through the hall, a voice that didn't belong to anyone I could see. It sent a shiver down my spine. I finally snapped out of my paralysis. I bolted for the door, my footsteps echoing through the empty house as I fled. The walls seemed to close in on me, and I could feel eyes on my back, watching, waiting. Just as I reached the front door, it slammed shut in front of me with a force that rattled the entire house. Panic set in, and I fumbled with the handle, desperate to get out. When I finally burst through the door, I didn't stop running until I was safely back in my car. My hands trembled as I started the engine, the house looming in my rearview mirror like a haunting reminder of what I had just escaped. As I drove away, I could have sworn I saw a figure standing in one of the upstairs windows, watching me leave. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the dark, empty halls of the house, heard the whispers in the walls. I knew I would never return, but the memory of that day stays with me, haunting my thoughts whenever I pass by an abandoned building. Some places I've learned are better left unexplored. It was one of those nights where the highway seemed to stretch on forever, an endless ribbon of asphalt disappearing into the darkness. I was exhausted, but the thought of stopping at a sketchy motel didn't appeal to me, so I kept driving. That's when I saw him, a lone hitchhiker standing on the side of the road, his thumb out and his face half hidden in the shadows. Against my better judgment, I pulled over. He climbed in without saying much, just a muttered thanks. As he settled into the passenger seat, I tried to make small talk, but he wasn't much of a conversationalist, only offering vague, unsettling responses. His silence was chilling, kind that makes you question whether you made the right decision. Still, I told myself he was just tired, like me. I pushed my unease aside. As we drove, I noticed little things that didn't add up. His clothes were dirty, but didn't seem worn. His shoes barely scuffed despite his supposed long trek. And then there was the way he kept glancing at me from the corner of his eye, as if sizing me up. The eerie tension in the car grew with each passing mile, and I began to regret picking him up. The highway was empty, not a single car in sight, and the isolation only amplified the unease. I kept one hand on the wheel and the other near my phone, just in case. That's when he spoke, his voice low and sinister, asking me if I believed in fate. The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. My pulse quickened as I glanced at him, trying to gauge his intentions. Before I could answer, he leaned closer, his breath hot against my ear, as he whispered something I'll never forget. "You were meant to find me tonight." The chilling statement sent a wave of fear crashing over me, and I realized with dawning horror that this was no ordinary hitchhike. His presence felt wrong, haunting, even, and I knew I had to get him out of my car. I tried to stay calm, offering a weak smile as I searched for an excuse to stop. The highway stretched on, unforgiving and endless. He seemed to sense my fear, his demeanor shifting from quiet to menacing. I could feel his eyes boring into me, his intentions growing darker with each passing second. I had to act fast. Finally, I spotted an exit sign and made a quick decision. I told him I needed to stop for gas, my voice shaky but firm. He didn't argue, just nodded, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't fooled. As I pulled into the gas station, I saw a chance to escape. I told him I'd be right back, leaving the engine running as I stepped out of the car. The moment my feet hit the pavement, I bolted for the station's door, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear him shouting after me, his voice twisted with anger. But I didn't look back. Once inside, I begged the clerk to call the police, barely able to catch my breath. When I finally glanced outside, the hitchhiker was gone, vanished into the night. The police arrived soon after, but they found no trace of him. It was as if he had never been there at all. The officers assured me it was probably just a drifter. The haunting feeling lingered long after they left. I couldn't shake the thought that I had narrowly escaped something far worse than just a bad decision. Now, whenever I drive down that highway, I keep my doors locked and my eyes on the road. I've learned my lesson. Some strangers are better left in the dark, no matter how lonely the road ahead may seem. We were a family that loved the outdoors, always eager for a new adventure. This time, we decided to explore a remote forest we'd heard about, one untouched by tourists, full of natural beauty and mystery. The day started off like any other hike, with the kids laughing and the crisp air filling our lungs. But as we ventured deeper into the woods, the atmosphere began to change, taking on an eerie stillness that set my nerves on edge. It was when we stumbled upon the strange symbols carved into the trees that the unease truly set in. The markings were ancient, etched deep into the bark, and seemed to follow a pattern we couldn't decipher. My husband joked that it was just a local prank, but I couldn't shake the feeling that these symbols were a warning, one we didn't understand. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor, the sense of dread grew stronger. The woods, once so inviting, now felt oppressive, as if they were watching us. Sounds of nature, the chirping birds, the rustling leaves, faded into an eerie silence. Even the kids, usually so full of energy, were subdued, sensing the change in the air. We decided to head back, but as we retraced our steps, the path seemed unfamiliar. The trail we had followed so confidently earlier in the day now twisted and turned in ways that didn't make sense. Panic began to creep in as we realized we were lost. The woods, once a place of beauty, had become a labyrinth of shadows, trapping us within its haunting embrace. Nightfall came quickly, wrapping the forest in darkness. We tried to stay calm, using our flashlights to navigate, but the beams only illuminated more of the unsettling symbols, now glowing faintly in the dark. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that something ancient and malevolent was watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. The sound started then, soft, distant at first, growing louder. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, echoing through the trees. We stopped, holding our breath, but the footsteps didn't. They grew closer, circling us, predator toying with its prey. My heart raced as I clutched my children close, trying to shield them from whatever was out there. We broke into a run, desperation fueling our every step, but no matter how fast we went, the footsteps kept pace. Forest seemed to twist and shift around us, leading us in circles. Every tree looked the same, every path a dead end. It was as if the woods themselves were trapping us, refusing to let us leave. Finally, we burst into a small clearing, gasping for breath. Footsteps stopped, but the silence that followed was even more terrifying. We didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw them. Glowing eyes staring at us from the darkness. They watched us with a chilling intensity full of malice and hunger. In a final act of desperation, we made a break for it, running blindly through the forest. Somehow, by sheer luck or fate, we stumbled upon the edge of the woods. The moment we crossed that invisible boundary, the oppressive weight lifted and the sounds of the normal world returned. We didn't stop running until we were safely back in our car. As we drove away, the dark silhouette of the forest loomed in the rearview mirror, a haunting reminder of what we had narrowly escaped. We've never spoken of that night since. The memory lingers, constant warning to never underestimate the power of the unknown. We were excited for our weekend getaway, a remote Airbnb nestled in the woods, perfect for some peace and quiet. The listing promised a cozy cabin with all the modern amenities, and the pictures made it look like something out of a fairy tale. When we arrived, everything seemed perfect. The air was crisp, the cabin was charming, and the seclusion was exactly what we needed. But that feeling didn't last long. The first night, we noticed something odd. There was a slight hum coming from somewhere in the house, a sound too low to pinpoint. First, we thought it might be the pipes or the old wiring, but as the night went on, it became more unnerving. Every time we tried to sleep, the hum seemed to grow louder, almost as if it was coming from the walls themselves. By the second day, we had mostly dismissed it as the quirks of an old house. We spent the day hiking and enjoying the outdoors, trying to relax. But that evening, as we were settling in for the night, we made a chilling discovery. Hidden behind a decorative vent in the living room, we found a small camera, pointed directly at where we had been sitting. Suddenly, the hum from the night before didn't feel so innocent. A sense of dread washed over us as we realized that we might not be as alone as we thought. We began searching the cabin, and what we found confirmed our worst fears. There were more cameras, tiny, almost imperceptible, hidden throughout the house. In the kitchen, the bathroom, even the bedroom. Felt like our every move had been watched since we arrived. Panic set in as we tried to decide what to do. The thought of confronting the owners crossed our minds, but we had no idea who they really were or what their intentions might be. Every creak of the floor, every rustle of the wind outside seemed to carry a new threat. We packed our bags as quickly as possible, deciding to leave immediately. Just as we were about to step out the door, we heard a car pull up outside. Our hearts raced as we peeked through the window, spotting a figure stepping out. It wasn't just a random visitor. It was the owner, and they weren't alone. Two more figures emerged from the car, their faces obscured by the shadows. The fear became suffocating. We had no choice but to hide. We retreated to the bedroom, locking the door behind us and trying to stay silent. Through the thin walls, we could hear them enter the house, their footsteps echoing ominously through the cabin. They spoke in low voices, but we couldn't make out what they were saying. All we knew was that they were looking for something, or someone. Minutes felt like hours as we waited, terrified of what might happen next. The footsteps grew closer, then stopped right outside the bedroom door. We held our breath, listening to the sound of the doorknob turning. But just as they were about to enter, a loud crash from the other side of the house drew their attention away. It was our chance. We slipped out of the bedroom window quietly as possible and ran into the woods. The darkness swallowed us, but we didn't stop until we were far from the cabin, out of breath and shaking with fear. We could still hear the distant sounds of the owners searching the house, but we didn't dare look back. Our only goal was to reach the car and get away. When we finally made it to safety, we contacted the authorities, but by the time they arrived, the cabin was empty. The owners had disappeared, leaving no trace behind. The whole experience felt surreal, like a nightmare we couldn't wake up from. We never found out who they were or what they intended. But one thing was clear: we were never meant to leave that cabin. Now, whenever we book a place to stay, we double-check everything. That weekend taught us that you can never be too careful, especially when you think you're alone. Some places hold secrets that are better left undiscovered. I boarded the train late at night, expecting nothing more than a quiet ride to my destination. Carriage was nearly empty, just a few tired passengers scattered throughout. The hum of the engine and the gentle rocking of the train were almost soothing as I settled into my seat, letting the darkness outside blur into the background. But as the journey continued, something felt off, a chilling sense of wrongness that I couldn't shake. First was subtle. Train seemed to be moving slower than it should, the lights flickering now and then. I tried to brush it off, thinking it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But when I glanced at the time, I realized we should have passed several stations by now. Yet, there were no signs of stopping, just an endless track stretching into the unknown. The other passengers seemed just as uneasy, casting nervous glances around the carriage. One by one, they began to leave their seats, moving toward the doors, as if trying to find a way off. But every time they reached for the handle, doors wouldn't budge, trapping us inside. The realization hit me like a cold wave. This train wasn't going where it was supposed to. We were trapped on a ride to nowhere. As the minutes turned into hours, the atmosphere grew more oppressive. The lights flickered more frequently, casting eerie shadows across the faces of the passengers. Sound of the engine became distorted, almost like a low, haunting wail. It felt like the train was alive, feeding on our fear, taking us deeper into the darkness with no hope of escape. I tried to speak to the conductor. The compartment was empty, as if he had vanished into thin air. The intercom crackled. No announcements came through, just a chilling static that seemed to echo the dread building inside me. The other passengers huddled together, whispering in panicked tones, but no one had any answers. We were all in the same terrifying limbo. Then, something even stranger happened. The windows, once showing the dark countryside, began to blur and twist. The outside world dissolved into a surreal landscape, full of shadows and ghostly figures that seemed to float alongside the train. It was as if we had crossed into another dimension, one where the rules of reality no longer applied. The haunting images outside mirrored the growing fear inside the carriage. the passengers began to disappear. One moment they were there, the next, gone, without a trace. I watched in horror as the woman sitting across from me faded into nothingness, her terrified expression the last thing I saw. Panic gripped me as I realized that I might be next. The train seemed to be feeding on us, consuming our very existence. Desperation took over. I searched the carriage for any way to escape, but every door, every window was sealed tight. The lights flickered one last time before plunging us into complete darkness. In that suffocating blackness, I could hear whispers, soft, chilling voices telling me that there was no escape, that this was the end of the line. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, the train came to a halt. The lights flickered back on, revealing an empty carriage. The other passengers were gone, and I was alone. The doors finally opened, and I stumbled out onto a deserted platform, my legs shaking with fear. The station was unfamiliar, shrouded in fog, and there was no sign of where I was or how I had gotten there. As I looked back at the train, its haunting silhouette against the fog, I knew I had narrowly escaped something far worse than I could comprehend. The station was silent, the air thick with an eerie stillness. I never found out where that train was taking us or what happened to the others. But I knew one thing for sure. I would never board a late-night train again. Our luxury cruise started like a dream. Blue skies, calm seas, and the promise of a relaxing getaway. The ship was massive, filled with every amenity you could imagine, and we couldn't wait to enjoy it all. But from the very first night, something felt off. The air in our cabin seemed colder than it should be, and there was an eerie silence that lingered in the hallways, even with hundreds of passengers aboard. The first strange incident happened on our second day. We were lounging by the pool when we noticed one of the deck chairs slowly moving on its own, sliding across the deck as if someone invisible had pushed it. We laughed it off, blaming the wind, but there was no breeze that day. The unsettling feeling grew stronger, and we began to notice more odd occurrences. Lights flickering, strange shadows in the corners of our vision, and doors creaking open and shut, no one around. At night, the ship took on a haunting quality. The gentle rocking of the ocean, once soothing, now felt ominous, as if something was lurking just beneath the surface. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to hear faint whispers, though no one was in the room. It wasn't just us. Other passengers started sharing their own eerie experiences. Unexplained noises, objects moving on their own, and even sightings of ghostly figures roaming the ship. Things took a darker turn when one of the passengers went missing. The crew searched the ship from top to bottom, but there was no sign of her. The security footage showed her walking down the hall toward her cabin, but after that, she simply vanished. No one knew what had happened. The tension on the ship grew palpable. It was as if the ship itself was swallowing people whole. By the fourth day, the haunting became impossible to ignore. We were in the ship's theater when the lights suddenly went out. When they flickered back on, the stage curtains were torn and strange symbols were scratched into the walls. The air was thick with a chilling presence, and we all rushed out, desperate to escape the oppressive atmosphere. But the ship felt like a labyrinth, every hallway leading us deeper into its eerie grip. We tried to report the incidents to the crew, but they dismissed our concerns, insisting everything was under control. Yet the fear in their eyes told a different story. They knew something was wrong. They couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge it. We were trapped on this haunted vessel, with no way to escape until we reached port. That night, the ship's engines suddenly stopped. We were adrift in the middle of the ocean, the lights flickering out, plunging us into darkness. Panic spread as passengers scrambled to find answers. The crew was nowhere to be found. The whispers returned, louder now, echoing through the halls like a haunting chorus. We huddled together in our cabin, praying for morning to come. When dawn finally broke, the ship was eerily quiet. The engines had restarted on their own, and the ship continued its course as if nothing had happened. The missing passengers were never found, and the strange occurrences didn't stop. We spent the rest of the cruise in a state of constant fear, never knowing what would happen next. When we finally docked, we couldn't get off the ship fast enough. The relief of being on solid ground was overwhelming, but the memories of that haunting voyage lingered. We never spoke of it again, but the experience left a mark on all of us. The luxury cruise we had dreamed of turned into a nightmare we could never forget. I arrived at the historic hotel late in the evening, weary from a long day of travel. The lobby was grand, filled with old-world charm, and the receptionist greeted me with a warm smile. But as she handed me the key to my room, I noticed a fleeting hesitation in her eyes. She mentioned that the room hadn't been occupied in decades, but she assured me everything was in order. I should have known that was my first warning. The elevator creaked as it ascended to the top floor, and when the doors opened, I stepped into a dimly lit hallway that seemed frozen in time. Faded wallpaper and antique furniture lined the corridor, and my footsteps echoed unnervingly as I made my way to the room. The number 713 was engraved on the door in tarnished brass, and as I unlocked it, the door swung open with a low, chilling groan. The room itself was beautifully preserved, a relic of a bygone era with its ornate bed, heavy drapes, and an old-fashioned vanity. But the air was thick with a cold, musty scent, and the silence felt unnatural, too heavy, too eerie. As I unpacked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, as if the room itself was aware of my presence. That night, sleep was elusive. I tossed and turned, my unease growing with every creak of the floorboards and rustle of the curtains. Just as I was about to drift off, a soft knock echoed from the door. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Who would be knocking at this hour? When I finally mustered the courage to check, the hallway was empty. Just the same dim lights and oppressive silence. I returned to bed, but the unease had morphed into a chilling fear. That's when I heard it. A faint, eerie whisper, so close it felt like it was right beside me. I bolted upright, scanning the room, but there was no one there. The shadows seemed to move on their own, shifting in ways that defied logic. I could feel a presence in the room, something cold and malevolent that wanted me gone. Desperation clawed at me as I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. But then the temperature dropped suddenly, and a dense, suffocating fog began to seep in from the corners of the room. My breath came out in visible puffs, and the once cozy bed now felt like a prison. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were a cacophony of chilling voices that seemed to come from every direction. Unable to stay any longer, I grabbed my things and rushed for the door. But as I reached for the handle, the door slammed shut on its own, locking me inside. Panic surged through me as I tugged and pulled. The door wouldn't budge. The whispers turned into sinister laughter, mocking my efforts. Felt like the room was closing in on me, determined to keep me trapped. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the door suddenly swung open and I stumbled into the hallway. The cold air followed me, and as I looked back, I could see the outline of a figure standing in the doorway, its form distorted and shadowy. I didn't wait to find out more. I ran down the hall, not stopping until I was safely in the lobby. The receptionist's expression said it all when I told her what happened. She simply nodded and offered me a new room without question, but I could see the fear in her eyes. Room 713 had claimed many guests over the years, she whispered. Not all of them had left. That night, I slept in a different room, but the memory of that haunted encounter stayed with me. I never returned to that hotel, and to this day, I wonder what might have happened if I hadn't escaped. The experience left me with a deep respect for the unknown, a firm resolve to never ignore those subtle warnings again. The open road stretched out before me, a solitary ribbon of asphalt cutting through the vast landscape. I was on a cross-country road trip, savoring the freedom of the journey, the miles passing beneath my tires. But somewhere along the way, I noticed it. Black SUV seemed to be following me. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence, but after an hour of the same vehicle tailing me, my nerves began to fray. I tried to shake it off, telling myself that the SUV was just heading in the same direction. But every time I changed lanes, they followed suit. When I sped up, they did too. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted, crept over me like a dark shadow. The highway that once felt liberating now seemed to close in around me, a trap from which I couldn't escape. As the miles dragged on, the situation grew more unnerving. I pulled off at a rest stop, hoping they'd continue on their way, but the SUV followed, parking a few spaces away. My heart pounded as I sat in my car, pretending to check my phone, all the while keeping an eye on the rearview mirror. The driver never got out, just sat there, their darkened windows concealing whatever sinister intentions they had. After a few minutes, I couldn't take it anymore. I started my car and pulled out, merging back onto the highway, my hands gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity. Sure enough, the SUV followed, maintaining a steady distance behind me. It was as if they were toying with me, letting me know they were there, always present, always watching. The unease turned into outright fear as I realized this wasn't going to stop. I considered calling the police, but out here in the middle of nowhere, I didn't even know where the nearest station was. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios, and every turn of the road seemed to lead me deeper into a nightmare. The SUV loomed large in my rearview mirror, haunting reminder that I wasn't alone. Desperation took over. I decided to confront them, pulling into a gas station and waiting in the car, watching as the SUV rolled in behind me. My heart raced as I stepped out, ready to face whoever was inside. But when I approached, the SUV suddenly sped off, tires screeching as it disappeared down the road. I was left standing there, shaken and bewildered. Relieved but still on edge, I filled up my tank and decided to take a different route, hoping to leave the stalker behind. For the next few hours, the road was blissfully empty, fear slowly fading. But just as I began to relax, I saw it again. Far in the distance, black SUV reappeared, closing in like a predator stalking its prey. Panic surged through me as I realized this wasn't over. I floored the gas pedal, pushing my car to its limits, but the SUV kept pace. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the road, and the isolation became suffocating. There was no escape, no turning back, just the relentless pursuit of this unknown threat. Finally, as darkness fell, I spotted a small town up ahead, its lights twinkling like a beacon of hope. I sped into the town, weaving through the streets, praying the SUV would lose track of me. When I finally pulled into a crowded parking lot, I scanned the area, no sign of the black SUV. It was gone, as suddenly as it had appeared. I waited, watching the road for any sign of my stalker, but they never returned. Exhausted and shaken, I checked into a motel for the night, locking the door and double-checking the windows. Sleep didn't come easily, the fear still gnawing at me. Even after the trip was over, the memory of that highway stalker haunted me. A chilling reminder of how quickly a peaceful journey can turn into a nightmare. We thought we'd hit the jackpot when we found the abandoned freighter drifting aimlessly in the ocean. As part of a salvage crew, this was the kind of find that could make our careers. The ship loomed in the mist, its massive hull rusted and eerie, like a ghost ship lost to time. Excitement buzzed among us as we boarded, but it didn't take long for the unease to set in. The silence was thick, oppressive, broken only by the creaking of the ship as it swayed with the waves. The inside was worse, corridors dark and damp, the air stale with a lingering stench of decay. We found no sign of the crew, no evidence of what had happened. The ship's logs were incomplete, cutting off abruptly as if someone or something had stopped them mid-sentence. The deeper we ventured, the more the atmosphere seemed to change, temperature dropping and shadows lengthening in ways that defied logic. Strange things began to happen. Tools moved on their own, doors slammed shut without warning, and the faint sound of footsteps echoed through the empty halls. We tried to explain it away, blaming the ship's old age and the ocean's tricks, but deep down, we knew something wasn't right. The freighter felt alive, watching us with a malevolent presence we couldn't shake. Then, we found the crew's quarters. The beds were unmade, personal belongings scattered as if they'd left in a hurry, but there was no sign of them. Just more eerie silence. That's when the whispers started. Soft, chilling voices that seemed to come from the very walls. They spoke in a language we didn't understand, but the fear they carried was unmistakable. Panic began to set in as one by one, our crew members started disappearing. First, it was our engineer, gone without a trace, his tools left behind. Then our communications officer, who had been trying to send a distress signal. We searched the ship, calling out their names, but the only response was the haunting echo of our own voices. The freighter had claimed them, and it wasn't done yet. We tried to leave. The ship wouldn't let us go. The engine, which had started up without explanation when we first boarded, now refused to stop. We were trapped, adrift in the middle of the ocean with no way to call for help. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the shadows seemed to close in on us from all sides. The ship had become a living nightmare, and we were its prisoner. Finally, with no other choice, we abandoned ship, leaving behind everything we had hoped to salvage. As we rowed away in the lifeboats, we watched the freighter fade into the mist, dark silhouette, haunting reminder of what we had narrowly escaped. We never spoke of that day again. The memory of the abandoned freighter and the crew that vanished still haunts us. Our weekend retreat in the woods was supposed to be a peaceful escape, a break from the stress of city life. The cabin was secluded, surrounded by dense forest, and the air was crisp and clean. First, everything was perfect. We spent our days hiking and our nights around the fire, the sounds of nature soothing our nerves. But on the second night, things began to change. The woods, once inviting, took on an eerie quality, and we started to sense that we weren't alone. It started with the sounds, soft, distant at first, but growing louder as the night wore on. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, footsteps that seemed to circle the cabin, but never come close enough to see. We tried to brush it off as animals, but the unease lingered. The forest felt different, darker, as if it was watching us, waiting for something. Then, we found the markings. Strange symbols carved into the trees around the cabin. Symbols that hadn't been there when we arrived. They were crude, almost primitive, and filled with a malevolent energy that sent chills down our spines. We didn't know what they meant. We knew they weren't good. The forest, once a place of beauty, had become a place of terror. The third night was the worst. The sounds grew louder, closer, and the air was thick with a sense of impending doom. The fire, which had always been a source of comfort, now seemed to cast sinister shadows that danced in ways that defied explanation. We huddled together, trying to stay calm. The fear was overwhelming. It felt like the forest was closing in on us, suffocating us with its dark presence. That's when the figures appeared, shadowy forms moving between the trees, barely visible but undeniably there. They circled the cabin, their movements slow and deliberate, as if they were taunting us. We couldn't see their faces, but we could feel their malice. The forest had become their domain, and we were intruders. Desperate, we decided to leave, even though it was the middle of the night. We packed quickly, our hands shaking with fear, and made our way to the car. But the forest wasn't done with us yet. The path, once clear, was now twisted and overgrown, and the shadows seemed to follow us, closing in with every step. It felt like a nightmare, a maze of terror with no way out. Finally, after what felt like hours, we broke through the tree line and reached the car. We didn't look back as we sped away, the dark silhouette of the forest looming in the rearview mirror. We never returned to that cabin, and we never spoke of that weekend again. The forest had let us go, but its haunting presence remains with us, a constant reminder of what we escaped. I had just moved into a new apartment, eager for a fresh start. The place was small but cozy, and the neighborhood was quiet. Perfect spot for me to settle down. The first few nights were peaceful, but then the nightmares began. It started with a feeling of heaviness in my chest, as if something was pressing down on me. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, unable to move, my body frozen in place. The room would be dark and silent, but I could feel a presence. Something cold and malevolent watching me from the shadows. At first, I tried to brush it off as sleep paralysis, a common phenomenon, I told myself. But the dreams, if they were dreams, grew more intense. The dark figures that lurked in the corners of my room began to take shape. They were tall, shadowy beings with no discernible features, but I could feel their malice. Their eyes, glowing faintly in the darkness, seemed to bore into my soul. Every night, they came closer until I could feel their icy breath on my skin. The worst part was the helplessness. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't escape their terrifying presence. The apartment, once a safe haven, had become a prison where I was at the mercy of these dark entities. The more I tried to fight them, the stronger they seemed to grow, feeding off my fear and despair. During the day, I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. I read about sleep paralysis, tried different techniques to break free from the episodes, but nothing worked. The nights became a living nightmare, and the fear of sleep began to consume me. I started staying up as long as I could, dreading the moment when I'd have to close my eyes and face the demons once more. Then, one night, things escalated. I woke up to the familiar feeling of paralysis, but this time, figures weren't just watching, they were touching me. Cold, bony hands pressed down on my chest, wrapping around my throat, choking the air from my lungs. The whispers, which had always been faint, now grew louder, filling my ears with their sinister voices. I could feel their hatred, their desire to drag me into the darkness with them. Desperate, I summoned all my strength and forced myself to move. It felt like trying to swim through thick mud, but I managed to break free from their grip. I leaped out of bed, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was empty, the shadows retreating to the corners, but I knew they were still there, lurking, waiting for the next time I fell asleep. That was the last straw. I moved out of that apartment the next day, leaving everything behind. The nightmares stopped after that, but the memory of those nights still haunts me. I've never experienced anything like it since, but I'm always wary of the shadows, always wondering if the demons are still out there, waiting for me to let my guard down. We thought we were moving into the perfect neighborhood. The houses were neat and tidy, the lawns well kept, and the neighbors friendly. It was everything we had hoped for, a safe, quiet place to raise our family. But from the moment we moved in, strange things started happening. It was small at first, doors creaking open on their own, lights flickering, and objects moving from where we had left them. We tried to brush it off, telling ourselves it was just the house settling, but the unsettling feeling grew stronger with each passing day. It wasn't long before we began to notice the strange behavior of our neighbors. They were always watching us, their eyes cold and unblinking, as if they were waiting for something. Their smiles never reached their eyes, and their conversations were stilted and strange. It was as if they were hiding something dark and sinister that lurked beneath the surface of their perfect suburban lives. One night, we woke to the sound of chanting, low, eerie voices that echoed through the house. We rushed outside, only to find our neighbors gathered in a circle on the street, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of candles. They were chanting in a language we didn't understand, their eyes locked on our house. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding, and we knew something terrible was about to happen. The next day, we found strange symbols carved into the walls of our home, symbols that matched the ones we had seen in the neighbors' circle. The atmosphere in the house grew oppressive, the air heavy with an unseen presence. We tried to contact the authorities, but every time we picked up the phone, the line went dead. It was as if the entire neighborhood was conspiring to keep us trapped in this nightmare. Desperate for answers, we began to investigate the history of the house and the neighborhood. What we found chilled us to the bone. The neighborhood had a dark past, one tied to an ancient ritual that had been practiced for generations. The houses, the people, the perfect suburban facade was all a cover for something much darker, something that required a sacrifice. We knew we had to leave, but the neighborhood wasn't going to let us go easily. The nights grew longer, the shadows deeper, and the sense of dread suffocating. The neighbors, once merely strange, now seemed openly hostile, their eyes gleaming with malevolent intent. The house, once our dream home, had become a prison, and we were its prisoners. Finally, with no other choice, we packed up what we could and fled in the middle of the night. As we drove away, the neighborhood loomed behind us, its dark secrets buried once more. We never looked back, but the memory of that place and the chilling ritual we narrowly escaped still haunts us. We've never spoken of it since, and we've never returned. I've always enjoyed late-night walks, quiet streets and cool air providing a peaceful escape from the day's worries. That night, the neighborhood was as quiet as ever. The only sounds the rustling of leaves and the distant hum of traffic. I took my usual route, winding through the familiar streets, lost in thought. But as I rounded a corner, I noticed something strange. Someone was following me. At first, I thought it was just another pedestrian, someone out for a walk like me, but their footsteps were too deliberate, too close. I quickened my pace, hoping to shake them off, but the footsteps matched mine, never missing a beat. Chill ran down my spine as I realized they weren't just following, they were stalking me. I turned onto a side street, hoping to lose them, but they stayed with me, their presence a dark shadow just out of sight. Peaceful night turned into a nightmare, and every step I took felt like a step closer to danger. The streetlights, once comforting, now seemed too dim, the shadows between them too deep. Desperate, I ducked into an alley, hoping to hide, but the footsteps grew louder, more insistent. I could feel their eyes on me, watching, waiting. The alley was a dead end, and I knew I was trapped. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to figure out a way out. The walls seemed to close in around me, the darkness suffocating. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, footsteps stopped. I held my breath, listening for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just silence. Slowly, I peeked around the corner, but the street was empty, as if my stalker had vanished into thin air. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. The feeling of being watched never left, and I knew they were still out there, waiting for the right moment. I rushed home, my heart still racing, and locked the door behind me. But the safety of my home felt fragile, as if the walls could crumble at any moment. The memory of those footsteps, that chilling presence, haunted me for weeks. I stopped taking night walks after that. Fear too much to bear. The neighborhood, once so familiar and safe, had become a place of lurking danger, and I never felt truly alone again. As a paramedic, I've seen my fair share of strange and unsettling things, but nothing could have prepared me for that night. We received a call about an emergency at an old, abandoned house on the outskirts of town, a place that had been empty for years, or so we thought. The dispatcher's voice was shaky, as if they didn't believe the call themselves, but we had a job to do. We arrived at the house, the night thick with fog, and the air heavy with a sense of foreboding. The house was dark, the windows shattered and the walls covered in ivy. It looked like it had been forgotten by time, but the call had been clear. Someone inside needed help. We approached cautiously, our flashlights cutting through the gloom. The door creaked open with a chilling groan, and we stepped inside, the air thick with the scent of decay. The inside of the house was even worse, dusty, damp, and filled with strange symbols scratched into the walls. We called out, but there was no answer, just the eerie silence of the empty rooms. We searched the house, room by room, our footsteps echoing in the stillness. It wasn't until we reached the basement that we found her. A woman lying on the cold, damp floor, her eyes wide with terror. She was still alive, barely. Her skin was pale, and her breathing shallow. We quickly loaded her onto the stretcher, our training kicking in despite the unease that hung over us. As we wheeled her out to the ambulance, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. Something that didn't want us to leave. Once inside the ambulance, things took a turn for the worse. The equipment started malfunctioning, monitors flickering, alarms going off without reason. The woman's condition deteriorated rapidly, and no matter what we did, we couldn't stabilize her. The air inside the ambulance grew thick and heavy, and the temperature dropped sharply. It felt like the very walls were closing in on us, suffocating us with a malevolent presence. Then, the woman's eyes snapped open, and she grabbed my arm with a strength that didn't match her condition. Her voice was weak, but filled with terror as she whispered, "It's still here. It's coming for me." Her words sent a chill down my spine, and I realized that whatever had brought her to that house wasn't done with her yet. We never made it to the hospital. The woman's heart stopped just as we crossed the town's outskirts, and despite our best efforts, we couldn't bring her back. When we arrived at the hospital, the doctors couldn't explain what had happened. They listed her cause of death as unknown, but I knew the truth. Whatever had claimed her wasn't something that could be explained by science. The memory of that night still haunts me. The image of her terrified eyes and the chilling words she whispered. I've never returned to that house, and I've never spoken of what happened inside that ambulance. But every time I hear the sirens, I'm reminded of the night I encountered something far beyond my understanding, something I hope to never face again. It was late, and I was just about to fall asleep when my phone buzzed with a text message. I groggily reached for it, expecting a late-night reminder or a message from a friend. But what I saw sent a chill down my spine. "You need to leave now. They're coming for you." The number was unknown, and there was no name attached to the message. At first, I thought it was a prank, but the urgency in the words made my heart race. I tried calling the number, but it didn't go through. The message sat there, ominous and foreboding, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I quickly checked the locks on my doors and windows, making sure everything was secure. But the uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. What if the message was real? What if someone really was coming for me? As I stood in the silence of my apartment, my phone buzzed again. Another message. "It's too late. They're here." Panic surged through me as I frantically looked around, but the apartment was empty, just as I had left it. I tried to tell myself it was just a cruel joke, but the fear was overwhelming. My heart pounded in my chest, and every creak and groan of the building seemed to signal impending doom. I decided to call the police, but just as I reached for the phone, the lights flickered and went out. The apartment was plunged into darkness, and the air grew thick with tension. My phone buzzed again, the screen lighting up in the darkness. "They're inside." The message sent a wave of terror through me, and I grabbed a flashlight, my hands shaking as I scanned the room for any sign of intruders. The apartment was silent, but the fear gnawed at me. I checked every room, every closet, but there was no one there. Just as I was about to convince myself it was all a prank, I heard a faint sound, footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway. My heart raced as I locked myself in the bedroom, my back pressed against the door as I tried to keep quiet. Footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside the door. I held my breath, praying they would go away. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. My phone buzzed one last time. "Goodbye." The screen went dark, and I knew I wasn't alone anymore. The police found me the next morning, huddled in the corner of my bedroom, my phone clutched in my hand. There was no sign of forced entry, no evidence of anyone else being there. But the messages were real, and the fear I felt was all too tangible. I moved out of that apartment the next day, leaving behind everything except the memory of that terrifying night. I never found out who sent those texts or what they meant, but the experience left me with a haunting fear that I'll never be able to shake. The rafting trip was supposed to be an adventure, a thrilling ride down a remote river surrounded by dense wilderness. We were a group of friends, excited for the challenge and the beauty of the untouched landscape. The river was fast and wild, the water churning around us as we navigated through the rapids. But as we ventured deeper into the wilderness, the river began to change. The water grew darker, colder, and the air took on a heavy, oppressive quality that made it hard to breathe. It wasn't long before we started noticing strange things. Shadows moving beneath the water, faint whispers carried on the wind, and the feeling of being watched. At first, we tried to brush it off as nerves, the adrenaline of the rapids playing tricks on our minds. But the deeper we went, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. The river, once a source of excitement, had turned into something sinister, a place where the line between the living and the dead seemed to blur. The first sign of trouble came when we found an old weathered raft caught in the rocks. It was half submerged, its wooden frame rotting and covered in moss. There was no sign of the people who had used it, but the sight of it sent a chill down our spines. River seemed to swallow all sound, rush of water growing louder, almost deafening, as if it was trying to drown out the truth. As we continued, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They echoed off the canyon walls, filling the air with eerie voices that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The shadows beneath the water grew darker, more distinct. We could see shapes moving just below the surface, figures that didn't belong to this world. The sense of dread was overwhelming, and we knew we had to get off the river. But the current was too strong, pulling us deeper into its icy grip. The water around us churned violently, and we could feel the presence of something ancient and malevolent, something that had claimed this river as its own. The whispers turned into screams, and the shadows reached up from the depths, grasping at our rafts, trying to pull us under. In a desperate attempt to escape, we paddled with all our strength. But the river had other plans. One by one, our friends were pulled into the water, their screams echoing in the night as the shadows claimed them. The river was alive with a dark energy, feeding on our fear and despair. It felt like we were caught in a nightmare, a place where the souls of the damned were trapped forever. Finally, with sheer determination and a stroke of luck, we managed to reach the shore. We dragged ourselves onto the bank, gasping for breath, our hearts pounding in our chests. The river roared behind us, a dark, endless expanse of water that had nearly claimed our lives. We never looked back as we stumbled through the woods, desperate to put as much distance between us and the cursed river as possible. To this day, the memory of that trip haunts us. The friends we lost, the shadows in the water, the whispers that still echo in our minds, something we'll never forget. We were lucky to escape with our lives, but the river of souls will always be a part of us, a dark reminder of the thin line between life and death. The climb had been grueling, but the view from the summit was worth every step. We stood on the peak, surrounded by jagged cliffs and towering rocks. The world spread out below us like a vast, untamed wilderness. The air was thin and cold, the wind biting at our faces as we took in the breathtaking sight. But as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the mountain, a sense of unease settled over us. The beauty of the moment was tainted by a creeping dread that none of us could explain. It started with the feeling of being watched. At first, we thought it was just the altitude, the exhaustion playing tricks on our minds. But the shadows seemed to move in ways that didn't make sense, twisting and stretching across the rocks, taking on shapes that were too deliberate to be natural. The mountain, once a place of triumph, had become something sinister, a place where the line between reality and nightmare blurred. As we began our descent, the air grew colder, and the wind howled through the canyons with a haunting wail. The shadows followed us, growing darker and more defined with every step. It felt like the mountain itself was alive, watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. The sense of dread was overwhelming, and the once clear path now seemed treacherous, as if the rocks were shifting beneath our feet. Then the hallucinations began. At first, they were subtle, flashes of movement out of the corner of our eyes, strange shapes that disappeared when we looked directly at them. But as we descended further, the hallucinations grew more intense. We saw figures standing on the cliffs, their forms dark and menacing, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. They didn't move, just watched us with an unsettling intensity. Panic set in as the hallucinations became more vivid. The shadows seemed to come alive, reaching out with twisted hands, trying to pull us into the darkness. The path, once familiar, now twisted and turned in ways that defied logic. We were lost, trapped on a mountain that had become a nightmare, with no way out and no one to help us. Desperation took over as we stumbled through the darkness, the shadows closing in around us. The wind howled with a deafening roar, drowning out our voices, and the air grew thick with the scent of decay. The mountain was alive with a dark energy, feeding on our fear and despair. Every step felt like a battle, every breath a struggle against the suffocating presence that surrounded us. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we found a way down, a narrow, treacherous path that led us to the base of the mountain. We collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath, our bodies trembling with exhaustion and fear. The mountain loomed behind us, its dark silhouette, haunting reminder of the nightmare we had narrowly escaped. We never spoke of that climb again, but the memory of the mountain of shadows still haunts us. The hallucinations, the twisted figures, feeling of being watched, it's something we'll never forget. The mountain had let us go, but its presence lingers in our minds, a constant reminder of the thin line between reality and nightmare. The old cabin in the woods had been abandoned for years, forgotten relic of a time long past. We bought it on a whim, eager to escape the city and renovate a place of our own. The cabin was rustic, charming in its own way, and we couldn't wait to bring it back to life. But as we began the renovations, quickly realized that the cabin held dark, terrifying secrets that were better left undisturbed. It started with the discovery of the hidden room. We were tearing down a wall in the living room when we found it, a small, windowless space that had been sealed off for decades. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of decay, and the walls were covered in strange symbols, etched deep into the wood. The room was filled with old, disturbing artifacts, rusted tools, broken dolls, and faded photographs of people we didn't recognize. The sense of unease grew stronger with each day. The cabin, once a place of excitement and potential, now felt oppressive, as if the very walls were closing in on us. The shadows seemed to move on their own, and strange noises echoed through the halls at night. Whispers, footsteps, and the faint sound of something scratching at the walls. We tried to brush it off as the cabin settling. Deep down, we knew something wasn't right. As we continued the renovations, the strange occurrences escalated. Objects moved on their own, doors slammed shut without warning, and the air grew colder, heavy with a malevolent presence. The cabin seemed to come alive, feeding off our fear and despair. The hidden room, once merely unsettling, now felt like a dark, festering wound in the heart of the cabin, a place where something terrible had happened. Then we found the journal. It was hidden beneath the floorboards, pages yellowed with age and filled with the frantic scrawls of the previous owner. The journal spoke of strange rituals, dark entities, and the horrors that had taken place within the cabin's walls. The final entries were desperate, filled with warnings to anyone who found the journal to leave and never return. The words sent chills down our spines, and we knew we had to get out. But the cabin wasn't going to let us go easily. The night we decided to leave, power went out, plunging the cabin into darkness. The air grew thick with tension, and the strange noises became louder, more insistent. The shadows in the hidden room seemed to come alive, twisting and writhing as if trying to escape. The cabin had become a living nightmare, and we were trapped inside. With no other choice, we fled into the night, leaving everything behind. The cabin loomed behind us, its dark silhouette a haunting reminder of the horrors we had uncovered. We never returned, and we never spoke of what we found inside those walls. The cabin of horrors still stands, its dark secrets buried within, waiting for the next unfortunate souls to stumble upon it. It was supposed to be a safe place, a small-town police station where I could seek refuge from the danger that had been chasing me all night. I had barely escaped a terrifying encounter on the road, and when I saw the lights of the station in the distance, relief washed over me. I staggered inside, out of breath and trembling, desperate for help. But as soon as I stepped through the doors, I knew something was wrong. The station was eerily quiet, the air heavy with a sense of foreboding. The officer at the front desk looked up at me with cold, calculating eyes, his expression unreadable. I tried to explain what had happened, but he didn't seem to care. Instead, he just stared at me, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the desk, as if he was waiting for something. The other officers were just as unsettling. They moved through the station like shadows, their faces expressionless, their eyes empty. No one asked me any questions. No one offered me any help. The station, once a place of safety, had become a prison, and I was trapped inside with people who seemed more interested in watching me than protecting me. As the night wore on, the tension in the station grew thicker. The officers whispered to each other in hushed tones, their eyes flicking toward me with a strange intensity. The air was filled with a heavy silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards and the distant hum of the fluorescent lights. I could feel their eyes on me, watching my every move, as if they were waiting for the right moment to strike. Desperate to leave, I tried to make my way to the exit, but the doors were locked, and the officers were always nearby, blocking my path. The sense of danger was overwhelming, and I realized that whatever had been chasing me outside was nothing compared to the terror I was facing inside. The police station had become a place of nightmares, and the officers were the ones I needed to fear the most. Then, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the station into darkness. The silence was suffocating, and I could hear the officers moving around me, their footsteps slow and deliberate. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for my phone, but the battery was dead, and there was no one to call for help. I was alone, trapped in the dark, the very people who were supposed to protect me. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, a door creaked open, and I saw a faint light at the end of the hall. I didn't hesitate. I ran toward it, my heart pounding in my chest. Officers were behind me, their footsteps echoing through the station, but I didn't look back. I burst through the door and into the night, gasping for breath as I stumbled onto the empty street. The station loomed behind me, its dark silhouette a haunting reminder of the terror I had just escaped. I never found out what was really happening inside those walls, and I never went back to that town. But the memory of that night still haunts me, a chilling reminder that sometimes the places we think are safe can be the most dangerous of all.